What if your mind could trap you in a single moment, replaying it endlessly like a broken record? Imagine being stuck in a spiral where your brain forces you to relive pain over and over, not because the moment holds importance, but because it believes pain is the only way to truly remember. This phenomenon is rooted deeply in how our brain encodes emotional memories. When you experience trauma or intense discomfort, your brain's survival mechanisms kick in. The amygdala, a small almond-shaped structure, floods your system with stress hormones like adrenaline and cortisol, etching the painful event into your memory with exceptional clarity. This process ensures you learn to avoid danger in the future. However, sometimes this survival system misfires, trapping you in a feedback loop where the painful memory keeps resurfacing involuntarily. Scientists call this the mind replay spiral, where your brain replays the negative event repeatedly, not for reflection, but because it's wired to treat pain as a signal of significance. This can explain why people with PTSD or anxiety disorders often find themselves obsessively revisiting traumatic episodes. The repetition reinforces the neural pathways linked to fear and distress, making the memory harder to escape. Even everyday negative experiences can trigger a smaller version of this spiral. For example, after a harsh criticism or failure, you might find your thoughts looping on that moment, amplifying its emotional weight. Your brain mistakenly prioritizes the negative experience, replaying it as a way to learn from it, even when it causes more harm than good. Understanding this helps us realize why breaking the spiral is vital for mental health. Techniques like mindfulness, cognitive behavioral therapy, or even simply shifting focus can weaken these pathways, retraining the brain to let go of pain as the only route to memory. So next time you find yourself stuck replaying a painful moment, remember, it's not about the moment itself, but your brain's misguided attempt to keep you safe. Imagine hearing your own voice, yet feeling like it belongs to someone else. That brief, unsettling moment when your self-image glitches and your identity seems to slip away. This is not just a poetic expression, but a real neurological phenomenon called the identity slip glitch. Scientifically, it arises from a temporary disconnection between your brain's auditory recognition and self-perception systems. Normally, your brain predicts your voice's sound and matches it with your internal self-model. But when this synchronization falters, due to stress, fatigue, or certain neurological conditions, the voice you hear becomes strangely alien. This phenomenon taps into the core of our sense of self. For example, people with depersonalization disorder often report this voice detachment, feeling like strangers in their own skin. Even healthy individuals can experience it fleetingly, like when waking from sleep or during moments of intense anxiety. Studies using functional MRI reveal that areas like the temporoparietal junction, crucial for integrating sensory input with self-awareness, temporarily misfire during these episodes. This mismatch confuses your brain's self-recognition pathways, causing a momentary identity slip. It is a reminder that our sense of self is a fragile, dynamic construct, constantly maintained by precise brain coordination. The next time you hear your voice and it feels unfamiliar, know that you're experiencing one of the mind's most subtle yet profound glitches, where identity itself momentarily escapes your grasp. Imagine staring at your reflection and suddenly feeling that something is off. Not because your face has changed, but because your brain momentarily forgets that the image in the mirror is actually you. This unsettling experience is known as the mirror detachment phenomenon, a real psychological effect that reveals how our brains construct our sense of self. Our brains constantly process sensory information to create a stable self-image. When you look in a mirror, visual data is integrated with your internal sense of identity. But sometimes, especially during prolonged staring or under certain mental states, this integration falters. The brain's recognition systems temporarily glitch, causing a momentary disconnection between who you know yourself to be and the image you see. Neurologically, this involves disruptions in areas responsible for self-awareness and facial recognition, such as the right inferior parietal lobule and the fusiform gyrus. When these areas misfire or become overloaded, the reflection appears alien, strange, or distorted, not because the mirror lies, but because your brain's usual confirmation of self is delayed or blocked. This phenomenon can be intensified by fatigue, stress, or altered states of consciousness. It's also linked to dissociative disorders where a person's sense of identity becomes fragmented. Yet, even healthy people can experience mirror detachment briefly, revealing the fragile and constructed nature of our self-perception. Understanding the mirror detachment phenomenon reminds us that our sense of self is not a fixed truth, but a dynamic mental creation, vulnerable to disruption. Next time you catch that fleeting disconnect, know that it's your brain's complex way of reminding you how deeply it shapes your reality. Imagine recalling a moment from your past, only to realize that what you remember never truly happened that way. This is the power of the memory reconstruction effect, a phenomenon where your brain doesn't store exact memories, but rebuilds them each time you recall. Memories aren't static snapshots, but dynamic constructions pieced together from fragments, emotions, and expectations. Neuroscience shows that every act of remembering triggers neural activity that can alter details, sometimes without awareness. This explains why eyewitness testimonies often conflict, and why personal memories can shift over time. Your brain edits the past, filling gaps with plausible guesses, blending facts with imagination. For instance, studies reveal that people can remember entire events that never occurred after subtle suggestions or new information, false memories created by the brain's reconstructive nature. This process happens because memory evolved not to archive reality perfectly, but to help predict and navigate the future. When you think back, you're not opening a flawless recording. You're rewriting a story with incomplete, malleable pieces. The memory reconstruction effect shows us that our past is not fixed but fluid, each recall a silent act of authorship, reshaping who we think we were. Imagine walking into a room and instantly becoming someone different, changing your tone, your mannerisms, even your beliefs, just to fit in. This is the essence of social camouflage syndrome, a psychological pattern where you shapeshift between versions of yourself depending on the social environment. But over time, this constant adaptation blurs the line between who you truly are and the many masks you wear. Humans are inherently social creatures, wired to seek acceptance and avoid rejection. To do this, our brains engage in a form of social mimicry, adjusting behaviors to match those around us. While this helps us navigate complex social landscapes, when taken to extremes, it leads to fragmentation of identity. You begin to question which version of yourself is authentic. Are any of them genuine or merely survival tactics? Research in psychology and neuroscience shows that this syndrome involves heightened activity in brain regions related to empathy and self-regulation, such as the prefrontal cortex and temporoparietal junction. These areas work overtime to constantly monitor and modify your social presentation. Over time, this can exhaust your sense of self, causing confusion and emotional distress. Examples are common. The person who is outgoing with friends but silent and reserved at work, the individual who suppresses their true opinions to avoid conflict, or someone who molds their identity to gain approval. Social camouflage syndrome often arises in those who grow up in environments demanding constant adaptation or in people navigating multiple cultural identities. Understanding this syndrome reveals a profound human challenge, balancing the need to belong with the need to be authentic. Recognizing your masks is the first step toward reclaiming a stable, integrated sense of self beyond social camouflage. Imagine experiencing a sudden, intense feeling that you've lived this exact moment before, a phenomenon known as déjà vu. This strange sensation arises because your brain mistimes the processing of the present, making the current experience feel like a replay, even though it has never actually happened before. Neuroscientific research suggests that déjà vu occurs when there's a brief glitch in the brain's memory systems, particularly between the temporal lobes and the hippocampus, areas responsible for recognizing familiarity and forming new memories. When sensory information arrives, the brain processes it through two pathways, one that interprets the present and another that checks for familiarity. If these pathways momentarily fall out of sync, the brain mistakenly signals that the current moment is a memory rather than new input. This mistiming causes your conscious awareness to feel as if time is looping, creating that eerie impression of reliving a moment. Déjà vu is often fleeting, but can be profoundly disorienting. It's more common in young adults and can be triggered by fatigue, stress, or new environments. Though still mysterious, understanding the time loop sensation sheds light on how our perception of reality depends heavily on precise neural timing. It reminds us that our sense of now is fragile, constructed by the brain in real time, and sometimes that construction falters, leaving us caught in an uncanny loop where the present feels like a past déjà vu. Imagine feeling your phone vibrate in your pocket, but when you check, there's nothing there. This eerie sensation is called the phantom response echo, a real neurological trick your brain plays when expectation meets sensory confusion. Our brains are wired to anticipate notifications, and this anticipation primes sensory pathways to interpret random stimuli as a vibration. Tiny shifts in muscle tension, ambient noise, or subtle pressure can be misread as that familiar buzz. Psychologists explain this as a type of hallucination rooted in prediction error. When the brain expects a signal but none arrives, it sometimes invents one to resolve the mismatch. Studies show that heavy phone users are especially prone to this phantom buzz, illustrating how repetitive behavior rewires our sensory expectations. This phenomenon is more than just a nuisance. It reveals how perception is not passive but actively constructed by the brain, blending reality with expectation. The phantom response. Echo reminds us that what we feel isn't always what actually happens, highlighting the fragile boundary between perception and illusion. Next time your pocket vibrates with no call, you're experiencing a glitch in your brain's predictive machinery, where desire shapes sensation, creating a ghostly echo of technology's call. Imagine feeling a sudden wave of panic without knowing why, a terror that doesn't seem to come from anything you see or hear. This isn't just your imagination. Science now shows that fear can be passed down through generations, encoded in our very biology. This is called the ancestral fear imprint. Your brain, shaped by countless ancestors who survived threats you never even faced, carries hidden warnings. It's as if their memories of danger are quietly embedded in your DNA, ready to trigger a response when you're unaware. Studies on epigenetics reveal how traumatic experiences can alter gene expression, passing fear responses from parents to children without changing the underlying DNA sequence. For example, research on mice found that if a parent smelled a particular scent linked to a shock, offspring also showed fear to that scent, even without direct exposure. Human studies echo this. Descendants of trauma survivors often exhibit heightened anxiety linked to their ancestors' experiences, such as war or famine. This inherited fear isn't just psychological, it is physiological, wired deep in brain structures like the amygdala. It alerts you, sometimes irrationally, preparing you to fight or flee from threats your conscious mind cannot identify. This is why you might panic in a seemingly safe situation. Your body is reacting to echoes of dangers long past. Understanding the ancestral fear imprint rewrites what it means to inherit trauma. It connects you to your lineage's silent battles, explaining those moments of inexplicable fear as a survival legacy. Your panic is not a flaw, but a whispered warning from your ancestors, etched in your cells, helping you survive in a world shaped by their stories. Imagine staring at your own hands and feeling like they belong to someone else. A subtle but unsettling rift between your body and your sense of self. This is dissociation drift, a fragile thread tethering you to reality, yet slipping beyond your full grasp. Scientifically, dissociation is a defense mechanism your brain employs to protect you from overwhelming stress or trauma. It fragments your conscious experience, creating a detachment from your body, emotions, or surroundings. When this drifts in and out, you might feel like an observer watching yourself from afar, or as if your hands, your voice, or even your memories are alien. This phenomenon arises because your brain struggles to integrate sensory input with your internal sense of identity. Areas like the temporoparietal junction and prefrontal cortex, responsible for bodily awareness and self-recognition, momentarily disconnect. The result? A haunting feeling of unreality called depersonalization. For example, during acute stress or panic attacks, your brain might trigger this drift to dull pain or emotional overwhelm, but it can become chronic in conditions like depersonalization disorder or PTSD. You might touch your hands trying to feel ownership, but they remain just out of reach emotionally, present, yet profoundly distant. It's a silent fracture inside your mind's seamless story, reminding you that your sense of self is a delicate construct, vulnerable to internal disruptions. Understanding this helps break the fear, knowing that dissociation drift is not a loss of self, but a survival strategy gone awry, signaling the brain's desperate attempt to shield you from unbearable realities. Imagine your mind trapped in a loop. A single phrase, a fear, or a word replaying endlessly, like a scratched record you cannot lift the needle from. This is the looping thought trap, a cognitive glitch rooted deep in our brain's architecture. Scientifically, it's linked to the brain's default mode network, responsible for self-referential thinking, which can become hyperactive, locking your attention on repetitive thoughts. This is more than just stubborn worry. It's a neurological feedback loop where the brain's error monitoring system constantly signals a problem without resolution, causing the same thought to spiral uncontrollably. Think of obsessive-compulsive disorder, where intrusive thoughts repeat with relentless urgency, or anxiety-driven rumination, where negative thoughts consume mental energy. This looping exhausts cognitive resources, impairing focus and decision-making. Studies show that stress hormones like cortisol amplify this effect, embedding the thought further into neural pathways. Breaking free requires conscious disruption. Mindfulness redirects attention. Cognitive behavioral therapy rewires thought patterns, and even simple distractions can break the cycle. Understanding the science behind the looping thought trap reveals why your brain fixates and how you can regain control. It's not weakness. It's the brain's attempt to solve a perceived threat that never goes away. The next time a phrase spins endlessly, remember, your brain is stuck in a loop, and awareness is the key to lifting the needle. Imagine standing at the edge of a new challenge, ready to leap but suddenly frozen, not by lack of desire, but because the fear of failing drowns out your courage. This is the heart of perfection paralysis syndrome, a psychological trap where the dread of imperfection stops you from even beginning. Our brains are wired to avoid pain and seek rewards. When the idea of failure becomes overwhelming, the amygdala, the brain's fear center, amplifies anxiety signals, overshadowing the prefrontal cortex's role in planning and motivation. This imbalance creates a mental gridlock where fear suppresses action, even when the potential gains are great. Perfection. Paralysis isn't laziness or lack of ambition, it's a deep-rooted emotional response. People caught in this cycle set unrealistically high standards, believing anything less than perfect equals failure. This all-or-nothing mindset magnifies the consequences of mistakes, turning potential learning moments into threats. Examples include artists who never finish projects, students who avoid tests, or entrepreneurs who delay launches. The syndrome feeds on procrastination and self-doubt, growing stronger with each avoided attempt. Recognizing perfection. Paralysis is crucial to breaking free. Embracing imperfection as part of growth, practicing self-compassion, and setting realistic goals can weaken fear's grip. When you learn that trying, even imperfectly, is success in itself, the paralysis begins to dissolve, making room for courage to take the first step. Imagine your mind vividly playing out the worst-case scenario. so real that your heart races, your palms sweat, and your body reacts as if disaster has already struck. This is the over-imagined catastrophe, a powerful psychological phenomenon where mental rehearsal triggers real physical responses. Neuroscience reveals that imagining intense events activates the same brain regions involved in experiencing them, like the amygdala and the autonomic nervous system, causing your body to prepare for danger that isn't actually present. This explains why anxiety can feel so tangible, even when the threat is imaginary. Studies show that the brain can't fully distinguish between real and vividly imagined events, which is why chronic worriers often suffer from real symptoms like increased heart rate or muscle tension. This mental simulation evolved as a survival tool, helping humans anticipate threats, but when overused, it traps the body in a state of stress. The over-imagined catastrophe reveals how thoughts alone can shape bodily experience, blurring the line between imagination and reality. When your mind rehearses disaster too vividly, your body answers the call, living through a catastrophe that exists only in your imagination. Imagine standing on the edge of success, only to trip yourself at the last moment. That slip isn't random or accidental. It's a deep, hidden reflex rooted in fear. The self-sabotage reflex activates when your subconscious senses that success might change your identity, disrupt your comfort zone, or isolate you from those you love. It's a protective mechanism, wired to keep you safe by preventing drastic change. Science reveals this behavior is linked to the brain's fear circuits and the amygdala, which monitors threats, even abstract ones like social rejection or loss of belonging. When success threatens your established identity, your brain can trigger stress responses, anxiety, and irrational doubts, all nudging you to sabotage progress. This is why people often procrastinate, abandon goals, or make choices that derail achievement just before reaching the finish line. Psychological studies show that self-sabotage often arises from unresolved fears: fear of failure, fear of being unworthy, or most profoundly, fear of success itself. Success demands adaptation, new roles, and sometimes distancing from familiar relationships. Your brain, prioritizing survival and emotional safety, may override rational plans with subconscious resistance. Understanding the self-sabotage reflex reframes these setbacks not as personal failures, but as emotional survival tools. Recognizing this internal conflict allows you to consciously face the fear, rewrite your identity story, and break free from the cycle. Success isn't just external achievement. It's evolving who you are, and overcoming self-sabotage is the first step toward embracing that change. Imagine sitting alone in a quiet room, yet feeling eyes on you, an invisible audience silently observing every move. This is the spotlight anxiety illusion, a powerful cognitive distortion where your mind convinces you that you are constantly under scrutiny, even when utterly alone. Rooted deeply in human evolution, this illusion emerges because our brains are wired for social survival. Millennia ago, being watched meant potential danger or social judgment, so our nervous systems developed hypervigilance to others' attention. Neuroscientifically, this illusion is tied to the brain's social monitoring networks, including the amygdala and the medial prefrontal cortex, which heighten alertness to social evaluation. Even in silence, your brain predicts and assumes scrutiny as a protective default. This causes anxiety, sweating, and self-consciousness, as if your every flaw is magnified on an internal stage. Psychologists call this the imaginary audience effect, where your self-awareness becomes distorted by a false sense of being observed. For example, when you rehearse a conversation alone or check your reflection repeatedly, your brain's spotlight shines on you too brightly. This illusion can trap people in cycles of fear and avoidance, impairing social confidence. Yet, understanding it as an evolutionary leftover helps reclaim control, recognizing that feeling watched is a mental echo, not reality. The spotlight anxiety illusion reveals how the mind's ancient wiring can misfire today, turning solitude into a stage and silence into a crowd. Imagine laughing at a joke, yet feeling detached. as if your emotions are running on a delayed timeline. Then, hours later, tears unexpectedly fall, triggered by a moment that should have passed. This is the emotional delay glitch, a fascinating disruption in how our brain processes feelings. Scientifically, it relates to the complex interplay between the amygdala, which processes emotions in real time, and the prefrontal cortex, responsible for rationalizing and integrating emotional signals. Sometimes, these systems get out of sync, especially under stress or trauma, causing a temporal lag in emotional responses. Neuroscientists call this emotional latency, where the brain postpones reacting to protect you from overwhelming feelings. For example, survivors of trauma often experience delayed emotional responses, feeling numb during an event, but breaking down hours or days later. This disconnect between experience and feeling challenges our sense of presence, making emotions feel alien or mistimed. Research shows that this delay can impair social bonding and memory consolidation, as the emotional context needed to embed memories properly is missing or shifted. Healing involves grounding techniques that reconnect body and mind, alongside therapies designed to recalibrate emotional timing. Understanding the emotional delay glitch sheds light on why your feelings sometimes seem out of sync, not a flaw, but your brain's way of managing emotional overload. Recognizing this temporal dance allows you to embrace your feelings fully, even when they arrive late. Imagine scrolling through your phone, endlessly checking notifications, even when none have arrived. This compulsive behavior isn't just habit, it's your brain wired like a lab rat, chasing the unpredictable drip of dopamine in a loop called random reward wiring. Neuroscience reveals that our brains evolved to seek rewards that are uncertain but potentially valuable. This variable reinforcement schedule activates dopamine pathways, releasing bursts of pleasure whenever a reward, like a new message or like, appears. Because these rewards are unpredictable, the brain's craving intensifies, much like a slot machine addict cannot resist the chance of a jackpot. Psychologist B.F. Skinner's experiments with animals demonstrated this effect vividly. Rats pressed levers more persistently when rewards were given randomly rather than predictably. Humans experience a similar pattern with digital devices, social media, and apps designed to hook attention through intermittent, unexpected feedback. This wiring hijacks our attention, creating compulsive checking and distraction, even when notifications hold little real value. It taps into deep survival mechanisms that once helped our ancestors stay alert for rare opportunities, now exploited by modern technology. Understanding random reward wiring helps us reclaim control by setting boundaries, turning off non-essential alerts, and practicing mindful use of devices. Recognizing that this craving is a brain trick, not true necessity, empowers us to break free from the dopamine chase and find peace beyond the ping. Imagine witnessing someone's actions and instantly creating a story in your mind about why they did it, only to believe that story as absolute truth. This is the false story formation, a cognitive bias where your brain fills in gaps with invented reasons to reduce uncertainty. Human brains crave patterns and explanations, even if it means constructing fiction. Psychologists call this confabulation, where the mind fabricates plausible narratives to maintain a coherent sense of reality. This tendency helps us navigate social complexities, but also leads to misunderstandings and false memories. For example, when someone ignores you, your brain might invent a reason, like anger or disinterest, without real evidence, and you behave accordingly. Neuroscientific studies show that the prefrontal cortex actively builds these stories to avoid ambiguity, prioritizing a neat narrative over raw uncertainty. This bias illustrates how our perception of others is less about facts and more about the stories our minds prefer to believe. The false story formation reveals the fragile boundary between reality and fiction within our own cognition. Next time you feel certain about why someone acted a certain way, remember, it might be a story your brain invented to avoid the discomfort of not knowing. Imagine recalling an event that hasn't even happened yet, a memory from the future that feels as real as your past. This strange phenomenon, known as the future memory leak, challenges our understanding of time and memory. Is it a glitch in how our brains process information, or something even stranger, like a crack in the fabric of reality itself? Neuroscience teaches us that memory is not a perfect recording, but a reconstructive process. When we remember, the brain pieces together fragments, sometimes mixing real experiences with imagined scenarios. This malleability can cause future events we anticipate or worry about to be misfiled as past memories. Our dreams, hopes, or fears can masquerade as recollections, creating false memories of things yet to come. Psychologists call this prospective memory, the brain's way of preparing for future tasks by simulating them in advance. Sometimes these simulations blur lines with actual memories, causing us to remember what is merely imagined. This overlap can create the eerie sensation of déjà vu or premonition. On a deeper level, some theories in quantum physics and consciousness studies speculate that time might not be strictly linear, allowing information from the future to subtly influence the present. While still speculative, these ideas highlight how fragile and mysterious our perception of time truly is. The future memory leak reveals that memory is less about truth and more about survival, helping us anticipate, prepare, and sometimes, mistakenly, relive the future as if it were the past. Imagine having a sudden bad thought and instantly feeling your body tense, as if the mere idea summoned a cosmic judge ready to punish you. This is the magic thinking reflex, a primal, deeply rooted psychological pattern where your mind falsely links thoughts to outcomes, as if thinking something bad could cause real-world consequences. This reflex traces back to early human survival instincts, where cause and effect weren't fully understood, so magical thinking helped predict and control uncertain dangers. Cognitively, it's tied to the brain's error detection and threat prediction systems, especially the anterior cingulate cortex, which amplifies caution when you sense possible risks. This reflex can spiral into anxiety or obsessive behaviors, like feeling guilt or fear over unwanted thoughts, believing they hold power beyond imagination. For example, someone might fear thinking, "What if I get sick?" will somehow cause illness, despite no logical connection. Neuroscience shows that magical thinking activates similar brain areas as actual threat detection, blurring lines between thought and reality. This explains why intrusive negative thoughts provoke physical stress responses, heart racing, sweating, muscle tension, as if fate is punishing you preemptively. Understanding this reflex reveals that thoughts themselves are not agents of destiny, but mental echoes shaped by survival wiring gone awry. Recognizing this frees you from the grip of irrational fear, teaching that your mind's magic thinking reflex is a misleading protective illusion, not a prophecy. Imagine calm slipping through your fingers as suddenly chaos erupts inside you, a wild storm sparked without warning. This is the emotional whiplash cycle, where your nervous system accelerates uncontrollably, hitting the gas even when no one is driving. Scientifically, this chaos comes from dysregulation in the autonomic nervous system, which controls our fight, flight, and freeze responses. Normally, the parasympathetic system balances the sympathetic gas pedal, calming us after stress. But in emotional whiplash, this balance shatters, causing rapid swings from tranquility to panic. Trauma, chronic stress, or anxiety disorders often hijack this system, keeping it stuck in high gear. Neurochemicals like adrenaline flood the bloodstream unexpectedly, triggering heightened alertness, racing heartbeats, or overwhelming dread without clear cause. This cycle drains energy, fractures focus, and disrupts emotional stability. For example, someone might feel perfectly peaceful one moment, then suddenly overwhelmed by irrational fear or rage. Breaking free requires re-regulating the nervous system through breathing techniques, mindfulness, and therapy that rebuild safety signals in the brain. Understanding the emotional whiplash cycle reveals why your feelings flip without warning, not randomness, but a nervous system struggling to find calm. Awareness and intent and intentional healing can help you regain control and smooth the ride back to emotional balance. Imagine laughing at a joke, but feeling no joy, or crying without the sting of pain, like your emotions are playing a role, but the real feelings are absent. This haunting state is known as the flat emotion effect, a psychological condition where emotional responses become muted or hollow, leaving you questioning if numbness has become your true self. At its core, this effect reflects disruptions in the brain's emotional processing centers, especially the amygdala and prefrontal cortex. These regions govern how we perceive, interpret, and express feelings. When their activity is dampened due to trauma, depression, or prolonged stress, the intensity of emotions fades, leading to a blunted affect. People experiencing flat emotions often describe a sense of disconnection, as if watching life from behind a glass wall. Their reactions may seem appropriate outwardly, but lack the inner depth that once colored experiences. This can be deeply isolating, making relationships and self-understanding challenging. Clinically, flat affect is common in depression, PTSD, and certain neurological disorders. It serves as a coping mechanism, shielding the mind from overwhelming pain, but at the cost of emotional richness. Over time, this numbness can seep into personality, altering how one interacts with the world. Recognizing the flat emotion effect is a crucial step toward healing. Through therapy, medication, and supportive environments, individuals can gradually reawaken their emotional range, reconnecting the heart to experience genuine joy, sorrow, and everything in between. Imagine standing in a crowded room feeling utterly drained, not from the noise or chaos, but from an invisible flood of emotions crashing against you. This is empathic overload syndrome, a real psychological and neurological state where highly sensitive individuals absorb the moods and feelings of those around them, like emotional sponges. Neuroscience shows that mirror neurons and the brain's limbic system allow us to intuitively sense others' emotions. But in some people, this empathy amplifies to overwhelming levels. Instead of simply recognizing feelings, their brains hyperprocess emotional cues, causing chronic stress and fatigue. Studies on highly sensitive persons reveal heightened activity in areas like the insula and anterior cingulate cortex, regions linked to emotional awareness and pain perception. This constant emotional static can feel like a storm battering the walls of one's mind, leading to social exhaustion that's invisible but deeply real. Empathic overload syndrome highlights the delicate balance between connection and overwhelm, reminding us that emotional boundaries are vital for mental health. The next time a crowd drains you, it's not just noise, it's the weight of countless emotions pressing in, a profound neurological echo of shared humanity. Imagine waiting for something so long that the wait itself becomes unbearable, worse than whatever you're waiting for. This is the anticipation anxiety burn, a phenomenon where your brain transforms the unknown into a battleground of fear, fueled by stress hormones and imagined disasters. It's not just impatience, it's a neurological firestorm. When you anticipate an uncertain event, your body releases cortisol, the stress hormone that prepares you to react to threats. But prolonged waiting keeps cortisol levels high, which doesn't just make you anxious, it rewires your brain to expect catastrophe. Your mind fills the blank space of the unknown with vivid, worst-case scenarios, magnifying fear beyond what reality justifies. Neuroscience reveals how this works. The amygdala, the brain's fear center, becomes hyperactive, while the prefrontal cortex, responsible for rational thinking, struggles to calm it down. This imbalance makes your imagination run wild, intensifying anxiety and creating a loop where the stress of waiting feeds more fear, which in turn feeds more stress. Psychologists find that this anxiety burn can cause physical symptoms too: racing heart, sweating, insomnia, turning simple waiting into an ordeal. Ironically, when the awaited moment finally arrives, it often proves less daunting than the mental storm you endured beforehand. Understanding the anticipation anxiety burn helps you recognize how your brain exaggerates fear in the face of uncertainty. By grounding yourself in the present and regulating stress responses, you can extinguish this internal fire and face the future with clearer calm. Imagine a moment when everything you believed suddenly shatters, when the rules, the roles, the reasons that shaped your world unravel into an overwhelming void of meaninglessness. This is the existential collapse point, a profound psychological experience where the brain confronts the absurdity of existence. At its core, it's a collision between the mind's search for meaning and the chaotic reality that resists neat explanation. Neuroscience reveals this state involves heightened activity in the default mode network, responsible for self-reflection, paired with diminished regulation from the prefrontal cortex, which normally helps us maintain order and purpose. This imbalance can trigger intense feelings of despair, confusion, and a heavy chest, as if the weight of life's meaninglessness physically presses down on you. Philosophers like Camus describe this as the moment when the absurd reveals itself, forcing a reckoning with the fragility of constructed realities. For example, during a crisis or deep reflection, you might suddenly see your social roles as arbitrary performances, your goals as hollow, and the future as uncertain. This collapse can feel terrifying, but it's also a doorway to growth. By facing the absurd, you can choose to create your own meaning despite chaos. Understanding the existential collapse point teaches that feeling lost is part of the human condition, a dark but necessary phase in the journey toward authentic self-awareness and freedom. Imagine speaking mid-sentence when suddenly your mind blanks. You rewind the moment, but only static fills the space where memory should be. This is the fog of recall, a mysterious lapse where your brain's memory signals temporarily cut out. Neuroscience reveals this glitch involves disruptions in the hippocampus, the brain's core memory hub responsible for encoding and retrieving information. Stress, fatigue, or multitasking can overload neural circuits, causing brief memory blackouts. During these lapses, your brain fails to consolidate or access the information in real time, like a poor radio connection skipping crucial audio. Research shows the prefrontal cortex, which organizes attention and working memory, also falters, making it difficult to hold on to thoughts. This phenomenon is common in conditions like transient global amnesia or in everyday tip-of-the-tongue moments. The fog of recall impairs focus, fractures conversations, and fuels frustration as time slips away from conscious awareness. To counter it, experts recommend reducing cognitive overload, improving sleep, and practicing mindfulness to strengthen neural pathways. Understanding the fog of recall reveals the delicate dance of memory's transmission and how easily it can be interrupted, not a sign of failure, but a natural brain pause. Next time your memory fogs, remember it's just a momentary static, and clarity is only a breath away. Imagine going about your day feeling as if invisible cameras follow your every move, and every choice you make is judged by an unseen audience. This is the essence of surveillance self-activation, a psychological state where you perform life as if constantly being filmed, even when you're completely alone. This phenomenon is rooted in the brain's social monitoring systems. The medial prefrontal cortex and the anterior cingulate cortex are key players in self-awareness and social evaluation. When these areas are hyperactive, they amplify your sensitivity to how others might perceive you, turning your internal dialogue into a running commentary filtered by imagined observers. Evolutionarily, this heightened self-monitoring helped humans navigate complex social hierarchies, avoiding behaviors that could lead to exclusion or punishment. But in modern life, it can become a double-edged sword, creating stress, anxiety, and a loss of authentic spontaneity. People experiencing surveillance self-activation might find themselves censoring thoughts, altering behaviors, or avoiding risks to maintain a polished image. This constant self-surveillance can be exhausting, eroding confidence and blurring the line between true self and performed self. Understanding this state offers a path to reclaiming freedom. Mindfulness practices, cognitive behavioral therapy, and self-compassion can reduce the grip of the imaginary audience, helping you live more authentically, unfiltered, unobserved, and unapologetically yourself. Imagine going about your day feeling as if invisible cameras follow your every move, and every choice you make is judged by an unseen audience. This is the essence of surveillance self-activation, a psychological state where you perform life as if constantly being filmed, even when you're completely alone. This phenomenon is rooted in the brain's social monitoring systems. The medial prefrontal cortex and the anterior cingulate cortex are key players in self-awareness and social evaluation. When these areas are hyperactive, they amplify your sensitivity to how others might perceive you, turning your internal dialogue into a running commentary filtered by imagined observers. Evolutionarily, this heightened self-monitoring helped humans navigate complex social hierarchies, avoiding behaviors that could lead to exclusion or punishment. But in modern life, it can become a double-edged sword, creating stress, anxiety, and a loss of authentic spontaneity. People experiencing surveillance self-activation might find themselves censoring thoughts, altering behaviors, or avoiding risks to maintain a polished image. This constant self-surveillance can be exhausting, eroding confidence and blurring the line between true self and performed self. Understanding this state offers a path to reclaiming freedom. Mindfulness practices, cognitive behavioral therapy, and self-compassion can reduce the grip of the imaginary audience, helping you live more authentically, unfiltered, unobserved, and unapologetically yourself. Imagine carrying invisible crates inside your mind, containers filled with emotions you never had the time to process. These are your boxed emotions, stored away to keep you functioning in the moment. But over time, the pressure inside these sealed crates grows, and the smallest trigger can set off an explosive release. Neuroscience shows that when you suppress emotions, whether from stress, trauma, or daily overwhelm, your brain doesn't erase them. Instead, it locks them away in parts of the brain like the amygdala and hippocampus, where they quietly simmer. This emotional storage helps you cope temporarily, but creates a ticking time bomb. Psychologists explain how this leads to disproportionate reactions. A minor comment, a sudden noise, or an unexpected event can burst open these emotional crates, causing you to react with intensity far beyond the situation. This is why seemingly small things feel like emotional landmines, detonating feelings of anger, sadness, or fear you thought were long buried. The longer emotions stay boxed, the harder it becomes to unpack them without help. Chronic suppression rewires neural pathways, making it easier for stress and anxiety to overwhelm your conscious mind. This stored emotional energy doesn't disappear, it just waits, hidden beneath your daily interactions. Understanding boxed emotion storage teaches you that your triggers are not random flaws, but echoes of unprocessed feelings. Facing these emotions with compassion and care can unlock the crates, freeing you from unexpected outbursts and helping you reclaim emotional balance. Imagine spinning multiple masks on a stage, each role demanding your full presence: parent, worker, friend, creator, until they whirl so fast they blur into one confusing swirl. This is the identity overload spiral, where juggling too many versions of yourself causes your core identity to fracture and fade. Psychologically, humans crave coherent selfhood, but when stretched thin across conflicting roles, the mind struggles to integrate them into a stable narrative. Neuroscience points to the medial prefrontal cortex, which constructs our sense of self, becoming overwhelmed by competing demands and fragmented memories. The result? Moments of confusion where you ask, "Who am I really?" This phenomenon is common in modern life, where social media, work, and relationships pressure us to perform endlessly. For example, someone might act confident at work, nurturing at home, but inwardly feel hollow, disconnected from any authentic self. Over time, the brain's attempt to keep up with shifting personas can lead to dissociation or emotional exhaustion. You forget which version is the real you because each role carries different expectations, emotions, and memories. Understanding the identity overload. Spiral reveals that your self is not fixed but fluid. And without intentional reflection, the blurring becomes disorienting rather than liberating. This insight invites you to reclaim coherence by prioritizing self-awareness over performance, grounding your identity in what truly resonates beyond the spiral's chaos. Imagine losing hope, and your mind reacts like an addict facing withdrawal, scrambling desperately for any fix. This is the hope withdrawal effect, a profound psychological and neurological phenomenon where the brain grapples with the sudden absence of anticipated positive outcomes. Neurologically, hope activates the brain's reward circuitry, especially the ventral striatum and prefrontal cortex, releasing dopamine that fuels motivation and emotional resilience. When hope fades abruptly, dopamine levels plunge, triggering symptoms similar to withdrawal, restlessness, anxiety, and craving for relief. Psychologists observe this effect in chronic illness, grief, and trauma survivors who cycle through denial, distraction, or compulsive behaviors to escape the emotional crash. This mental scramble is not weakness, but a survival mechanism, your brain seeking to avoid despair by any means. Studies show that this withdrawal disrupts cognitive flexibility, making it harder to process reality and adapt. Healing from the hope withdrawal effect involves rebuilding neural pathways through small, achievable goals and mindful acceptance, restoring dopamine balance and emotional stability. Understanding this effect helps us see why losing hope feels so devastating and why recovery demands patience and compassionate self-care. The next time hope slips away, remember, your mind is craving its reward, and with gentle persistence, it can find its way back. Imagine losing hope, and your mind reacts like an addict facing withdrawal, scrambling desperately for any fix. This is the hope withdrawal effect, a profound psychological and neurological phenomenon where the brain grapples with the sudden absence of anticipated positive outcomes. Neurologically, hope activates the brain's reward circuitry, especially the ventral striatum and prefrontal cortex, releasing dopamine that fuels motivation and emotional resilience. When hope fades abruptly, dopamine levels plunge, triggering symptoms similar to withdrawal, restlessness, anxiety, and craving for relief. Psychologists observe this effect in chronic illness, grief, and trauma survivors who cycle through denial, distraction, or compulsive behaviors to escape the emotional crash. This mental scramble is not weakness, but a survival mechanism, your brain seeking to avoid despair by any means. Studies show that this withdrawal disrupts cognitive flexibility, making it harder to process reality and adapt. Healing from the hope withdrawal effect involves rebuilding neural pathways through small, achievable goals and mindful acceptance, restoring dopamine balance and emotional stability. Understanding this effect helps us see why losing hope feels so devastating, and why recovery demands patience and compassionate self-care. The next time hope slips away, remember, your mind is craving its reward, and with gentle persistence, it can find its way back. Imagine hearing a voice inside your mind that sounds like you, but sharper, colder, crueler. This is the inner critic possession, a psychological phenomenon where your brain generates an internal narrator that relentlessly judges, doubts, and undermines you. Neuroscience reveals that this voice emerges from hyperactive activity in the brain's default mode network, especially the medial prefrontal cortex, which is involved in self-referential thinking. While self-reflection is normal, an overactive inner critic distorts your self-image into a harsh, unforgiving judge. Psychologists link this voice to early life experiences and learned patterns of negative self-talk that become deeply ingrained. It's as if your mind hosts a cruel guest who always speaks first, setting a tone of self-doubt before you can even respond. This internal dialogue impacts mental health profoundly, fueling anxiety, depression, and low self-esteem. The inner critic possession is a haunting reminder that part of your mind can turn against you, wielding words as weapons. Understanding this voice is the first step to silencing it recognizing it as a distorted echo, not your true self. Imagine smiling through pain so often that your genuine emotions start to fade beneath the surface. This is the forced positivity reflex, a psychological survival mechanism where you downplay your suffering and amplify gratitude, not because you want to, but because you feel you have to. It's a reflex shaped by social expectations and internalized rules that silence the scream behind the smile. Neuroscience shows that this reflex engages brain areas involved in emotion regulation, like the prefrontal cortex, which suppresses negative feelings to maintain social harmony. But this constant suppression doesn't erase pain. Instead, it buries it deeper, creating emotional tension that grows with each forced smile. Psychologists warn that forced positivity can lead to emotional exhaustion and a disconnection from authentic feelings. When gratitude is overstated and pain minimized, your mind learns to mask distress, making it harder to recognize and express true needs. Over time, this can intensify anxiety, depression, and feelings of isolation. Social conditioning fuels this reflex, teaching many to avoid vulnerability by staying positive at all costs. But beneath the surface, that smile becomes a silent scream, a desperate signal that you're not allowed to fully express your pain or struggle. Recognizing the forced positivity reflex is the first step toward healing. Allowing yourself to feel pain without judgment and expressing it authentically breaks the cycle. True strength lies not in masking discomfort, but in embracing your whole emotional truth, even when it's difficult. Imagine waking each morning not with energy, but with a fog so thick it feels like part of your very identity. This is the exhaustion identity merge, a state where chronic fatigue no longer feels like a symptom, but becomes intertwined with who you are. Scientifically, prolonged exhaustion rewires the brain and body's stress responses. The hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, responsible for regulating energy and stress hormones, remains hyperactive, draining your reserves continuously. Neurologically, this leads to impaired cognitive function, emotional numbness, and disrupted sleep cycles, creating a vicious cycle where rest becomes elusive. Fatigue ceases to be a passing state and instead shapes your self-perception, altering your sense of time, motivation, and presence. For example, people with chronic fatigue syndrome or burnout often describe themselves as living in a haze, struggling to remember life before exhaustion dominated. This identity merge distorts boundaries between physical condition and selfhood, making recovery feel like reclaiming a lost self rather than simply regaining energy. Understanding the exhaustion identity. Merge illuminates how deeply fatigue can infiltrate the mind, turning a health challenge into an existential crisis. Recognizing this is the first step toward disentangling your identity from relentless tiredness and reigniting the spark of restored vitality. Imagine your mind locked in an endless rehearsal, planning every outcome, simulating every response, because controlling the imaginary feels safer than facing the uncontrollable real. This is the control fantasy loop, a cognitive pattern where the brain seeks security in detailed mental simulations to reduce uncertainty and anxiety. Neuroscientifically, this loop involves hyperactivation of the prefrontal cortex, responsible for planning and prediction, combined with an overactive amygdala that signals fear of unpredictability. The brain creates repetitive what-if scenarios as a protective shield, attempting to anticipate threats and rehearse responses. But this mental overdrive paradoxically increases anxiety, as it traps attention in a cycle of endless possibilities without action. Research links this loop to obsessive-compulsive tendencies and generalized anxiety disorder, where overthinking replaces engagement with reality. The loop consumes cognitive resources, hampers decision-making, and fuels a feeling of helplessness despite the illusion of control. Breaking free requires grounding techniques, acceptance of uncertainty, and therapeutic interventions that help the brain tolerate unpredictability. Understanding the control fantasy loop reveals why your mind clings to imagined control, not stubbornness, but a survival strategy against chaos. Awareness is the first step to loosening this mental grip and stepping bravely into the unknown. Imagine wearing a mask so long that it becomes part of your very skin. The roles you play, the faces you show to the world, they blend so seamlessly with who you are that removing them feels like tearing away your own identity. This is the crushing reality of mask wear fatigue, a deep psychological exhaustion born from constant performance. Humans adapt by wearing social masks to fit in, protect themselves, or survive hostile environments. At first, these masks are tools, conscious strategies to navigate life's demands. But over time, relentless pretending reshapes neural pathways in the brain, embedding these facades into your sense of self. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for self-regulation and identity, becomes intertwined with these performed roles, making the mask feel like the real you. This fusion creates profound inner conflict. You may feel disconnected, exhausted, and uncertain about your true emotions or desires. The longer the mask stays on, the harder it becomes to distinguish performance from authenticity. Taking it off risks exposure, vulnerability, and the terrifying question, who am I beneath this mask? Mask wear. Fatigue is common among people in high-pressure roles, those facing chronic stress, or anyone constantly suppressing their true selves. Breaking free requires gentle self-exploration, supportive relationships, and sometimes professional help to rediscover and reclaim your authentic identity beneath the mask. Imagine slowly building walls inside your mind, brick by brick, shutting people out, not to hurt, but to protect yourself from pain. This is the mental wall build, a psychological process where repeated emotional wounds trigger the brain to create barriers against vulnerability. Neuroscience shows that trauma and chronic stress can alter the brain's amygdala and prefrontal cortex activity, heightening threat detection and dampening social reward circuits. Over time, these changes harden your emotional defenses, making it difficult to trust or connect. What began as self-protection becomes isolation, as the gates you raised become locked, even when you long to open them. Studies reveal that this wall building isn't conscious, but a survival mechanism encoded deep in neural pathways. Yet, these walls also block healing, trapping you in loneliness and misunderstanding. The mental wall. Build reveals how the brain's instinct to protect can become a prison, blurring the line between safety and isolation. Recognizing this pattern is the first step to gently dismantling the walls and reclaiming connection. Imagine a mind that never rests, constantly scanning every detail, every glance, every shift in tone, like a radar tuned to danger. This is hyper-awareness syndrome, where your brain becomes wired to notice too much, filing away every subtle cue. It's not just heightened perception, it's a survival adaptation shaped by past experiences and fears. Neuroscientific research shows that in hyper-awareness, the amygdala, the brain's alarm center, becomes overactive, constantly signaling threats, even when none exist. Meanwhile, the prefrontal cortex struggles to filter irrelevant information, leading to sensory overload and anxiety. Your nervous system stays on high alert, expecting the worst in every interaction. Psychologists find that hyper-awareness often stems from trauma or chronic stress, where early experiences taught your brain that vigilance equals safety. This leads to a hypervigilant state, where normal social cues feel like potential threats, causing exhaustion and difficulty focusing. This syndrome rewires your perception, making you prone to overinterpretation and misreading benign situations as dangerous. Every glance feels loaded, every tone suspicious, your mind filing threats where there are none, preparing for battles that never come. Understanding hyper-awareness syndrome helps you recognize this pattern as a protective but burdensome reflex. Through mindful practices and therapy, you can retrain your brain to relax its constant watch, freeing yourself from the relentless grip of fear and reclaiming peace. Imagine retreating deeper into your comfort zone, seeking safety like a refuge from life's uncertainties. But paradoxically, the safer you try to feel, the smaller your world shrinks. This is the safety hole paradox, a psychological trap where the quest for comfort slowly confines you within invisible walls. Your brain, wired to avoid threats, reinforces avoidance behaviors, reducing exposure to new experiences. The amygdala, guardian of fear responses, signals danger at every unfamiliar step, tightening the boundaries of your safe space. Over time, this shrinking world feels secure yet suffocating, like a padded prison. Activities once routine become daunting, relationships narrow, and growth stalls. For example, someone might decline social invitations or avoid challenges, believing safety lies in isolation. But this isolation deepens loneliness and anxiety. The paradox lies in how comfort becomes confinement. Safety morphs into stagnation. Understanding the safety hole. Paradox reveals a profound truth. True security isn't avoiding risk, but learning to face it with resilience. Expanding your boundaries gently challenges the brain's fear circuits, slowly reversing the shrinking spiral. This insight invites you to step beyond the walls of your comfort zone, embracing uncertainty as the path to freedom and genuine safety. Imagine feeling a sudden wave of panic crashing over you like a storm without clouds, thunder roaring from a sky that never warned you. This is the storm without a sky, a phenomenon where anxiety erupts seemingly out of nowhere, disconnected from any clear trigger. Neuroscience explains this as a misfiring in the brain's threat detection system, particularly involving the amygdala and insula, which monitor danger signals and bodily sensations. Sometimes, these areas activate without external cause, creating a false alarm that floods the body with adrenaline and cortisol. This leaves you gasping, heart racing, overwhelmed by fear with no identifiable source. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for rational thought, struggles to calm the alarm, making the panic feel inexplicable and uncontrollable. This condition often appears in panic disorder and generalized anxiety, where the nervous system remains hypervigilant, ready to react to threats that aren't there. The resulting storm disrupts daily life, causing avoidance and distress. Managing this invisible tempest involves grounding techniques, slow breathing, and cognitive behavioral therapy to retrain the brain's threat response. Understanding the storm. Without a sky reveals the mystery behind sudden panic, your brain sounding alarms in the absence of danger, and the path to reclaiming calm through awareness and care. Imagine catching your reflection in a mirror and feeling absolutely nothing. No recognition, no warmth, just a hollow disconnection. The face looking back is yours, the body you inhabit, yet the link between self and image crackles and fades like static on a broken signal. This eerie sensation is known as the stranger in the mirror, a profound psychological state revealing how fragile our sense of self can be. This phenomenon arises when the brain's integration of visual input and self-awareness falters. Normally, regions like the right inferior parietal lobule and the precuneus work together to bind your physical appearance with your identity. But when this connection weakens, due to trauma, dissociation, or neurological disruption, the reflection no longer feels familiar. People experiencing this may describe a sense of alienation, as if their own body is a costume worn by a stranger. It's common in depersonalization disorder and certain dissociative conditions, where the boundary between self and external world blurs painfully. The stranger in the mirror challenges the notion that our identity is fixed or permanent. It reveals that our feeling of self depends on delicate neural networks that can unravel, leaving us strangers to our own image. Understanding this experience opens paths to healing. Through grounding techniques, therapy, and rebuilding the mind-body connection, reclaiming the once familiar face behind the glass. Imagine waking up one morning certain it's Tuesday, only to realize hours, or even days, have vanished without memory. This bewildering experience is known as the time skip effect, a cognitive phenomenon where your brain fails to record or retrieve continuous moments, making entire periods feel lost. Neuroscience reveals that time perception relies on the brain's hippocampus and prefrontal cortex working together to encode events sequentially. When these systems are disrupted due to stress, fatigue, or altered states, your memory gaps and the flow of time feels fragmented. For example, during high stress or monotony, the brain may deprioritize encoding routine moments, causing days to blur into one another. Studies of patients with dissociative disorders show that this effect can be extreme, with large time segments feeling like a void. Even healthy individuals experience brief time skips during zoning out or intense focus. The time skip effect reveals the fragile nature of temporal awareness, showing how easily our sense of continuous reality can fracture. When you lose track of days, it's your brain's imperfect way of managing overload, sacrificing time's continuity to survive. Imagine sending a message and hearing nothing back. In that silence, your brain doesn't find peace. It builds a storm. This is the silence rejection bias, a mental trap where absence of reply is not neutral, but is interpreted as personal rejection. Your nervous system treats silence like a threat, triggering fear and anxiety before any explanation. Neuroscience reveals this bias is rooted in our social survival instincts. Humans evolved in tight-knit groups where being ignored meant danger, loss of protection, resources, or status. The amygdala, our brain's fear center, activates when faced with social silence, heightening vigilance and creating emotional pain akin to physical harm. Psychological studies show that silence rejection bias leads to rumination, replaying scenarios, imagining worst-case outcomes, and feeling excluded or unloved. This magnifies social anxiety and can distort relationships, making neutral or benign silences feel like deliberate punishment. Our modern communication, with its digital delays and ambiguous pauses, intensifies this bias. The constant expectation of instant replies fuels a feedback loop of assumed rejection, even when none exists. Silence becomes a mirror reflecting fears rather than reality. Understanding the silence rejection bias frees you to reframe silence, not as absence, but as space. Recognizing this reflex can calm your nervous system, easing anxiety, and restoring trust in the unspoken pauses that are part of all human connection. Imagine a scent suddenly flooding your mind, a texture brushing your skin, or a distant tone stirring tears you can't explain. This is the genetic memory trigger, an eerie phenomenon where fragments of ancestral experiences surface, bypassing your personal memory entirely. Scientifically, genetic memory suggests that certain memories, especially traumatic or vital survival information, may be encoded not only in the brain but also biologically passed down through DNA. Studies in epigenetics reveal how environmental stresses can alter gene expression, influencing descendants' emotional responses without conscious awareness. For example, descendants of trauma survivors may experience inexplicable anxiety or vivid sensations linked to events they never lived through. The brain's limbic system, responsible for emotion and memory, may be wired to respond to these inherited cues, triggering emotional floods without a clear origin. This phenomenon shows that memory is layered, not just a personal archive, but a biological tapestry woven from generations. Understanding genetic memory. Triggers deepens our grasp of identity and inheritance, revealing how the past silently shapes our present in profound, unseen ways. It reminds us that some memories live far beyond our personal history, echoing through blood and time. Imagine carrying the weight of being the good one for so long that saying no feels impossible. You find yourself drowning in a sea of yeses you never truly meant. This is the moral compass burnout, a psychological state where relentless self-sacrifice depletes your emotional reserves and blurs your boundaries. Neuroscience shows that empathy and moral decision-making engage brain regions like the anterior cingulate cortex and the temporoparietal junction, which regulate compassion and social reasoning. But chronic overuse of these circuits, especially under stress or perfectionism, exhausts the neural systems responsible for self-regulation and assertiveness. Psychologically, this burnout manifests as guilt when setting boundaries, a compulsion to please, and eventual emotional fatigue. The brain's reward system, once fueled by acts of kindness, becomes depleted, leaving behind frustration and resentment. This state compromises mental health, increasing risks for anxiety and depression. Recovery involves retraining the brain through practices like assertiveness training, self-compassion, and mindful boundary setting. Understanding the moral compass. Burnout helps you realize that self-care isn't selfish. It's necessary for sustaining your moral strength. The next time you feel overwhelmed by unwanted yeses, remember, saying no is an act of courage and kindness to yourself. Imagine catching a faint scent, a particular perfume, or the smell of rain on dry earth, and suddenly, without warning, your body plunges back into a moment from childhood. You feel unsafe, vulnerable, overwhelmed, even though your mind hasn't fully processed why. This is the emotional flashback flare, a powerful and involuntary journey where sensory triggers ignite buried memories, causing your body to time travel before your conscious mind catches up. Neuroscientifically, this happens because sensory inputs, especially smells, have a direct line to the brain's limbic system, the emotional center where memories are stored. The olfactory bulb, responsible for processing smells, connects intimately with the amygdala and hippocampus, regions that encode emotional memories. When a scent matches a past traumatic experience, it can trigger an immediate, automatic emotional response without conscious awareness. During an emotional flashback flare, the nervous system reacts as if danger is present now, flooding your body with stress hormones like adrenaline and cortisol. This prepares you to fight, flee, or freeze, even though you are physically safe in the present moment. The disconnect between body and mind creates confusion and distress. People with PTSD or unresolved trauma often experience these flares. Recognizing and understanding them is crucial for healing, allowing one to develop coping strategies that anchor the mind back to the present and soothe the body's ancient alarms. Imagine feeling a subtle shift in someone's attention, a slight pullback in affection, and suddenly your entire nervous system floods with alarm, screaming abandonment before your conscious mind can process what's happening. This is the affection withdrawal panic, a primal response rooted in the brain's ancient survival circuits. Neuroscience shows that the amygdala, responsible for detecting social threats, reacts instantly to perceived withdrawal, triggering a cascade of stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline. These chemicals flood your body, preparing you to respond to what your brain interprets as a social danger, potential rejection, or loss of connection. Evolutionarily, this response helped early humans survive, as social bonds were critical for safety. However, in modern life, even minor emotional distance can provoke this intense panic, often disproportionate to the reality of the situation. Psychologists link this reaction to attachment styles formed in early childhood, where inconsistent caregiving sensitizes the brain to abandonment cues. The affection withdrawal. Panic highlights how deeply wired our need for connection is, and how fragile our emotional equilibrium can be. Before reason intervenes, your body has already sounded the alarm, a raw, visceral plea for belonging. Imagine your mind suddenly flooded with vivid, unwanted images, horrible scenes that burst in uninvited, shattering your focus and peace. These intrusive images surge without warning, leaving you questioning their meaning or fearing your brain is malfunctioning. But science tells a different story. Intrusive images are a hallmark of the brain's complex warning system, rooted in the amygdala and visual cortex. When trauma, anxiety, or stress overwhelms you, your brain can misfire, replaying distressing visuals as a protective but flawed mechanism. It's an attempt to process danger, even when none exists in the present moment. Psychologists understand intrusive imagery as part of conditions like PTSD and obsessive-compulsive disorder, but they also appear in everyday anxiety. These images aren't messages or omens, they're glitches in how your brain filters and handles emotional information, a storm in your neural circuits. Research shows that these surges reflect heightened brain sensitivity to threat cues, where the mind's filtering system fails, allowing distressing content to break through. The more you resist or fear them, the stronger they can become, creating a feedback loop of distress. Recognizing intrusive image surges as a neurological misfire, not a personal failure, empowers you to regain control. Techniques like mindfulness and cognitive behavioral therapy help retrain your brain's response, calming the surge and restoring mental peace. Imagine facing danger, and instead of running or fighting, your body goes utterly still, locked in place by an ancient survival instinct. This is the freeze instead of fight response, a primal reflex where freezing becomes the brain's last-ditch strategy to avoid further harm. Scientifically, when the brain perceives an overwhelming threat, the autonomic nervous system can trigger a shutdown in the face of helplessness, immobilizing the body as if becoming invisible to predators. Neurobiologically, this involves activation of the dorsal vagal complex, part of the parasympathetic system, which slows heart rate and decreases movement to conserve energy and protect vital functions. Unlike the fight or flight response, freezing doesn't prepare you to act, but to survive by going unnoticed or minimizing damage. This reaction is common in trauma survivors, explaining why some feel stuck during frightening events or later in flashbacks. For example, victims of assault may find themselves unable to scream or flee, their bodies frozen by this reflex. Understanding the freeze. Instead of fight response, sheds light on how the body prioritizes survival over action, revealing that stillness isn't weakness, but a deeply wired protective mechanism. Recognizing this helps trauma survivors reclaim agency, knowing their frozen moments were their body's way of trying not to break. Imagine reaching for your wallet, not to buy what you need, but to fill a hollow space inside, a fleeting moment to feel alive amid the void. This is the emotional spending compulsion, a psychological and neurological cycle where shopping becomes a desperate attempt to soothe emotional emptiness. Neuroscience links this behavior to the brain's reward system, particularly the nucleus accumbens and dopamine pathways, which light up during pleasurable experiences like buying. Yet, when underlying emotions like loneliness, anxiety, or boredom drive the urge, the temporary dopamine surge fails to heal deeper wounds. Instead, it creates a loop where the brain craves repeated fixes to chase diminishing highs. Psychologists observe this compulsion as a form of emotional regulation gone awry, where spending masks pain rather than addressing it. Over time, this cycle depletes financial and emotional resources, leaving a sense of emptiness behind. Healing requires awareness of the triggers, building healthier coping strategies like mindfulness, social connection, and cognitive therapy to recalibrate the reward system. Understanding the emotional spending compulsion reveals why your soul swipes through a void, seeking life but finding only fleeting sparks. With insight and care, you can break free from the cycle and rediscover lasting fulfillment beyond the checkout line. Imagine living inside a mind where different parts of yourself were shaped by separate worlds, each with its own memories, beliefs, and emotions. These parts don't always agree. Sometimes they clash fiercely, leaving you feeling like a passenger in your own mind rather than its driver. This is the reality of fragmented self syndrome, a complex psychological state where identity feels divided and conflicted. This syndrome often arises from early trauma or prolonged stress when the brain compartmentalizes experiences to protect the core self. Neural pathways form distinct subpersonalities, or dissociated fragments, each holding its own narrative and emotional weight. The brain's default mode network, responsible for self-referential thought, becomes disrupted, making it hard to maintain a unified sense of identity. When these internal parts argue or sabotage each other, it can cause confusion, anxiety, and a profound sense of alienation. You might experience sudden mood shifts, conflicting desires, or an eerie feeling of watching yourself from outside. Recognizing fragmented self syndrome is the first step toward healing. Through therapy approaches like internal family systems or trauma-informed care, individuals can learn to negotiate peace among their inner parts, fostering integration and restoring the feeling of being the true author of their own mind. Imagine reaching a point where trying feels pointless, because failure isn't just possible, it's expected. This is the learned helplessness burn, a psychological state where repeated setbacks rewire your brain to expect defeat, dimming hope and motivation. Discovered in animal studies, learned helplessness occurs when subjects exposed to unavoidable stressors stop attempting escape, even when later given the chance. Neuroscience reveals that chronic exposure to uncontrollable adversity alters brain circuits, especially in the prefrontal cortex and hippocampus, impairing decision-making and emotional regulation. The stress hormone cortisol floods the system, reinforcing a cycle of despair. In humans, this manifests as depression or chronic stress, where success feels alien, like a foreign land your nervous system doesn't trust. For example, survivors of prolonged trauma or systemic failure often report this internal shutdown, unable to envision positive outcomes. Their brains have learned that effort leads to pain, so they cease to try. The learned helplessness burn exposes how our minds can be trapped in self-defeating loops, where the fear of failure becomes a barrier stronger than any external obstacle. It's a silent burn, burning out the very will to fight. Imagine standing before a task that feels too heavy to bear. Instead of confronting it, you convince yourself it doesn't matter, that it's not worth your time or energy. This is the avoidance decision loop, a mental pattern where your mind shields the scared, vulnerable child inside by turning away from challenges that trigger deep-rooted fears. Neuroscience shows this loop is powered by the brain's survival systems. The amygdala detects threat, and when it senses danger, real or imagined, it floods your body with stress hormones, urging escape. Meanwhile, the prefrontal cortex tries to rationalize, often producing self-talk that minimizes the task's importance, justifying avoidance. Psychologists explain that this reflex often stems from early experiences where failure or criticism caused pain. To protect the inner child, the brain creates a loop of denial, convincing you that the task is trivial or irrelevant, so you never have to face the emotional risk of trying and potentially failing. This cycle, while protective, can trap you in procrastination and low self-esteem, feeding anxiety and preventing growth. The more you avoid, the stronger the loop becomes, reinforcing the fear and the excuse. Understanding the avoidance decision loop helps you break free by acknowledging the scared child and gently facing the fear beneath the task. With mindful awareness and gradual exposure, you retrain your brain to see challenges not as threats, but as opportunities for healing and strength. Imagine feeling safest not in calm or quiet, but in the heart of chaos, because your earliest bonds of trust were forged amid turmoil. This is the crisis bond instinct, a deeply rooted psychological pattern where people habituated to instability find peace unfamiliar and even unsettling. Neuroscience shows that early attachment experiences shape how the brain's stress and reward systems develop. When trust forms amid unpredictability or danger, the brain links safety to crisis rather than calm. The amygdala and hypothalamus, which regulate fear and stress, become wired to expect volatility as normal, so peaceful environments trigger restlessness and anxiety instead of comfort. For example, individuals raised in chaotic homes may seek out drama or conflict unconsciously, as these states feel more predictable than silence. Psychologists observe this in trauma survivors who cling to high-stress relationships or environments, struggling to relax when stability arrives. This instinct reflects the brain's survival adaptation, where familiarity with crisis overrides the desire for serenity. Understanding the crisis bond. Instinct helps unravel why peace can feel foreign or even threatening. It reveals that healing requires rewiring these neural associations, gradually teaching the brain that calm can be safe too. This knowledge opens a path toward breaking the cycle, finding real security beyond the noise of chaos. Imagine looking back at your past, but the memories you see are not exact recordings. They are stories your brain rewrites to help you survive the present. This is the memory distortion lens, a scientifically grounded phenomenon where what really happened becomes a flexible scaffold shaped by your current needs and emotions. Neuroscience reveals that memory is not a fixed snapshot, but a reconstructive process involving the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex. Each time you recall an event, your brain rebuilds it, blending actual facts with feelings, beliefs, and even new information, often without conscious awareness. This adaptive mechanism protects your psychological well-being. Traumatic memories may be softened, painful details forgotten, or events reframed to preserve your sense of identity. For example, survivors of trauma might recall moments differently over time, focusing on elements that emphasize resilience rather than vulnerability. Yet this malleability also means memories can be unreliable, susceptible to suggestion or bias. Psychologists call this the reconsolidation process, where memory updates occur every time you remember. Understanding the memory distortion lens shows how our past is not a fixed truth, but a living narrative that evolves as we evolve. It's not deception, it's survival. The version of you still standing depends on these flexible memories, allowing you to navigate life with strength even if the past you remember shifts beneath your feet. Imagine reaching a point where nothing feels important anymore, not victories, not failures, because deep inside, your brain has stopped believing that anything truly has worth. This is the crushing reality of the value collapse spiral, a psychological state where motivation erodes as your sense of meaning and value collapses inward. This spiral often begins subtly, triggered by prolonged stress, trauma, or chronic disappointment. Neurologically, it involves dysfunction in the brain's reward system, particularly the mesolimbic dopamine pathway, and the prefrontal cortex, which governs goal setting and evaluation. When these circuits falter, the usual feelings of satisfaction or disappointment dim, leaving a hollow indifference. People caught in this spiral may feel detached from their ambitions, relationships, and even basic pleasures. Wins lose their shine, losses become meaningless. This numbness can spiral further into depression, apathy, or existential despair. Understanding the value collapse. Spiral is vital because it reveals how fragile our sense of worth can be, shaped by complex brain chemistry and life experiences. Healing often requires rebuilding meaning through connection, purpose, and sometimes professional support to reignite the neural pathways that make life feel valuable again. Imagine keeping your emotions tightly controlled, the pressure building silently inside. You hold it together perfectly, maintaining composure as stress piles up, until something seemingly minor, a word, a gesture, finally shatters your calm. This is the delayed explosion response, a real psychological and neurological phenomenon where emotional reactions are postponed, sometimes hours or even days after the triggering event. Neuroscience shows that chronic stress activates the brain's amygdala and hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, flooding the body with stress hormones like cortisol. Initially, the prefrontal cortex suppresses overt reactions to maintain control, but over time, this regulation weakens. When the emotional reservoir finally overflows, the reaction appears disproportionate and delayed. This phenomenon explains why people sometimes snap unexpectedly, long after the original stressor. Research in trauma survivors reveals similar delayed emotional outbursts linked to disrupted neural connectivity between regulatory and emotional centers. The delayed explosion response reminds us that emotional processing isn't always immediate. Our brains may defer reactions to protect functioning, but unresolved stress silently accumulates until it erupts. Understanding this can foster patience and compassion for those whose emotions arrive late but no less intense. Imagine feeling someone's discomfort before they even say a word, a sudden surge of emotion that pulls your attention away from yourself and onto them. This is the empathy compass overload, where your brain becomes a radar so finely tuned to others' feelings that their emotions feel louder, heavier, and more urgent than your own. Neuroscience shows that this phenomenon involves mirror neurons, brain cells that fire not only when you act, but also when you observe others experiencing emotions. These neurons enable empathy, but can overload when constantly activated, flooding your nervous system with emotional signals that blur the line between self and other. The anterior insula and anterior cingulate cortex, regions involved in emotional awareness and pain processing, become hyperactive, amplifying the distress you perceive in others. This can cause you to instinctively rearrange your behavior, softening your voice, changing your posture, suppressing your own needs to ease their discomfort, often at your own expense. Psychologists warn that chronic empathy overload can lead to emotional exhaustion, compassion fatigue, and even burnout. When your internal compass is hijacked by others' emotions, your own feelings get drowned out, leading to neglect of your well-being. Understanding empathy compass overload is the first step to setting healthy boundaries. By cultivating self-awareness and practicing emotional regulation, you can honor others' feelings without losing sight of your own, restoring balance between empathy and self-care. Imagine being caught in a loop where your mind drags you back to familiar pain, dressed in new faces, but carrying the same old wounds. This is the repetition compulsion cycle, an unconscious drive to relive trauma in the hope of mastering it. Freud first described this compulsion as the psyche's attempt to rewrite painful memories by recreating similar scenarios, believing that repetition will eventually grant control or resolution. Neuroscience shows that trauma embeds itself deeply in brain regions like the amygdala and hippocampus, reinforcing neural pathways that associate pain with survival. This makes breaking free difficult. Your brain craves the familiar, even if it hurts. For example, someone repeatedly entering toxic relationships or reenacting childhood conflicts may not realize they're caught in this cycle. Psychologically, this compulsion stems from a failure to integrate traumatic experiences fully, leaving the mind stuck in a liminal space between past and present. Each repetition is an unconscious attempt to process unresolved emotions and regain agency. Understanding the repetition compulsion cycle reveals how trauma's shadow lingers, shaping behaviors long after the event. Recognizing this cycle is the first step toward healing. By consciously interrupting patterns and seeking new narratives, you can break free and rewrite your story beyond the pain's costume. Imagine the clock ticking past midnight, but you're still awake, not from work or deadlines, but because the silence forces you to face thoughts you aren't ready to meet. This is the sleep avoidance habit, a psychological and neurological pattern where fear or discomfort around confronting one's own mind delays sleep. Neuroscience shows that the brain's default mode network, active during rest and introspection, can trigger anxiety when unresolved worries or suppressed emotions surface. Instead of surrendering to rest, your nervous system remains alert, flooding with stress hormones like cortisol, which block the natural sleep drive. This habit reinforces itself. The more you avoid sleep, the stronger the anxious anticipation becomes, creating a vicious cycle. Clinically, this is seen in insomnia and anxiety disorders, where bedtime becomes a battleground between desire for rest and fear of inner turmoil. Breaking the sleep avoidance habit involves cultivating a calming pre-sleep routine, mindfulness to gently face troubling thoughts, and cognitive behavioral therapy to rewire fear responses. Understanding this habit reveals why quiet moments can feel threatening, not because the night is scary, but because the mind is unprepared to be still. With awareness and care, you can reclaim peaceful sleep and soothe the restless mind. Imagine saying yes before you even realize it, smiling through discomfort and swallowing your true feelings because somewhere deep inside you learned that obedience was safer than speaking up. This automatic submission is known as the compliance conditioning reflex, a psychological pattern shaped by early experiences where survival depended on conformity and silence. From childhood, when expressing dissent brought punishment or rejection, the brain's threat detection systems became tightly linked to compliance behaviors. The amygdala, which processes fear, signals danger at the slightest hint of conflict, while the prefrontal cortex learns to suppress rebellion in favor of safety. Over time, saying yes becomes a reflex, a protective shield against harm. This conditioned obedience isn't weakness, it's an adaptive response that helped many endure harsh environments. But in adulthood, it can limit personal freedom, leading to resentment, anxiety, and loss of identity. You may find yourself trapped in patterns of people pleasing, unable to assert boundaries or express genuine desires. Breaking free from the compliance conditioning reflex requires conscious effort, recognizing automatic yeses, practicing assertiveness, and rewiring your brain's safety signals. With patience, you can reclaim your voice and choose when to say yes, not because you must, but because you want to. Imagine sinking so deeply into a single task that the rest of the world fades away. Pain, anxiety, and fear all muffled beneath your intense focus. This is hyperfixation distraction mode, a coping mechanism where your brain channels obsessive attention not out of discipline, but as a desperate strategy for survival. Neuroscience reveals that during hyperfixation, the brain's reward system, especially the dopamine pathways, become highly active, flooding you with a sense of control amid chaos. This intense focus triggers a shutdown of emotional centers like the amygdala, dulling distress signals. For individuals struggling with trauma, anxiety, or chronic pain, hyperfixation acts like an escape hatch, absorbing mental energy to drown out overwhelming sensations. Psychologists observe this behavior in conditions such as ADHD, obsessive compulsive disorder, and dissociation, where hyperfixation becomes both a refuge and a trap. While it can boost productivity, it often masks unresolved emotional turmoil. Hyperfixation. Distraction mode reveals how focus can be both a weapon and a shield, your mind's way of surviving by shutting out pain, even if only temporarily. Imagine feeling the sting of blame before anyone utters a word, carrying guilt like an uninvited shadow that arrives first and lingers longest. This is the guilt default mechanism, a psychological reflex where you absorb fault automatically, even when the situation wasn't your doing. Guilt volunteers to be the first to bleed, protecting relationships but often at great personal cost. Neuroscience reveals that this mechanism is linked to the brain's social pain network, including the anterior cingulate cortex, which processes both physical and emotional pain. When faced with conflict or failure, this region activates, triggering a desire to repair and reconnect. Blaming yourself becomes an instinctive way to diffuse tension and avoid rejection or abandonment. Psychologists explain that early experiences shape this reflex. Children taught that mistakes equal punishment or loss of love internalize guilt as a survival strategy. This automatic self-blame can become a chronic pattern, leading to anxiety, depression, and eroded self-worth. The guilt default mechanism, while adaptive in some social contexts, can trap you in cycles of unnecessary responsibility. It silences your inner voice and blurs boundaries, making it difficult to see when fault lies elsewhere. Recognizing this reflex allows you to step back and question automatic guilt. By practicing self-compassion and reframing your responses, you can break free from undue blame, reclaim your peace, and foster healthier relationships built on honest accountability, not silent sacrifice. Imagine carrying every emotional wound like precious coins in a hidden vault, stacking silence where healing should have taken root. This is the emotional hoarding phenomenon, a deep psychological pattern where unprocessed pain accumulates silently within, creating a weight that distorts the soul. Neuroscientifically, when emotions aren't fully processed, the brain's limbic system, especially the amygdala, remains hyperactive, storing trauma instead of releasing it. This leads to chronic stress responses, anxiety, and emotional numbness. Psychologically, emotional hoarding stems from avoidance, fear that confronting pain will overwhelm or shatter the self. Instead, wounds are locked away in mental compartments, seemingly contained but still alive beneath the surface. For example, someone may carry childhood grief or betrayal quietly for years, not realizing how these unhealed scars shape their reactions and relationships. This phenomenon creates an invisible prison, where accumulated trauma limits emotional freedom and personal growth. Understanding the emotional hoarding phenomenon reveals how vital processing and expression are, not just for relief, but for reclaiming vitality. Recognizing the pattern is the first step to unlocking the vault, allowing release to replace silence and transformation to follow. Imagine wearing a smile not as joy, but as armor, a shield forged from kindness to deflect danger before it reaches you. This is the smile as shield, a deeply ingrained psychological strategy where the brain uses social signals to protect itself from harm. Neuroscience shows that smiling activates mirror neurons, encouraging others to respond with trust and lowering the risk of conflict. Yet beneath the surface, this smile often masks anxiety, fear, or vulnerability, regulated by the brain's limbic system, especially the amygdala, which processes threats. Social conditioning and survival instincts teach many to perfect this mask early in life, especially in unsafe or unpredictable environments. Over time, the smile becomes a default defense mechanism, so well practiced that authentic emotions get suppressed or hidden. Psychologists observe this in people who avoid confrontation or emotional exposure by projecting warmth even when feeling fragile inside. While effective short-term, relying on this shield can lead to emotional exhaustion and disconnect from true self-expression. Healing involves learning to lower defenses safely, practicing authenticity, and building environments where vulnerability is met with acceptance. Understanding the smile as shield reveals why kindness can sometimes be a mask, and how courage lies in letting it fall. Imagine receiving a compliment and instantly feeling a knot of discomfort, a tension that tightens your chest and makes you doubt the kindness. This reaction, known as the praise aversion reflex, is more than shyness or modesty. It's a deeply ingrained psychological pattern where genuine praise triggers suspicion, making kindness feel like a manipulation or a setup for disappointment. Scientific research shows that this reflex often develops from early experiences where praise was inconsistent, conditional, or used as a tool for control. When compliments came with strings attached, like expectations, hidden criticism, or eventual rejection, the brain learned to associate praise not with warmth, but with threat. Neurologically, this involves the amygdala, which processes fear and threat, and the prefrontal cortex, which interprets social cues. For someone with praise aversion, the amygdala may overreact to positive social signals, interpreting them as potential traps. This heightened alertness triggers stress responses, making genuine compliments feel unsafe. For example, survivors of emotional abuse or neglect often struggle to accept praise without skepticism. They might deflect compliments, minimize achievements, or experience anxiety during positive feedback, fearing future punishment or failure. Understanding the praise aversion reflex is vital because it reveals how past pain shapes present perceptions. Healing involves retraining the brain through repeated safe experiences of acceptance and kindness, allowing compliments to be felt as genuine gifts rather than hidden threats. Imagine your mind running endless simulations of every possible way things could go wrong, replaying disasters, failures, and dangers in vivid detail. This is the threat imagination protocol, a survival mechanism wired deep into your brain. Neuroscience shows that your brain's default mode network and amygdala collaborate to forecast threats, using imagination as a rehearsal space for pain and fear. By mentally preparing for worst-case scenarios, your nervous system believes it can lessen shock and increase control if disaster strikes. However, this hyperactive forecasting can trap you in loops of anxiety, where imagined threats feel as real as actual ones. Studies reveal that people with anxiety disorders experience overactive threat imagination, causing chronic stress and impaired decision-making. For example, someone fearing public speaking might vividly imagine humiliation, their body responding with real symptoms like sweating or rapid heartbeat. This protocol evolved because anticipating danger improved survival, but in modern life, it can become a double-edged sword, protecting you from surprise, yet imprisoning you in fear. The threat. Imagination protocol reveals how your brain's gift for foresight can also become its greatest trap, where preparation becomes paralysis. Imagine crossing a finish line only to find it moving farther away. No matter how hard you strive, victory remains just out of reach. This is the unattainable standards loop, a psychological trap where you raise the bar the moment you approach success. Rest becomes unbearable, feeling somehow more wrong than failure itself. Neuroscience shows this loop is tied to the brain's reward system and stress circuits. Dopamine, the chemical of motivation and pleasure, spikes as you chase goals. But when the goalposts shift, satisfaction slips away. Meanwhile, chronic activation of the stress response floods your body with cortisol, making relaxation feel unsafe or undeserved. Psychologists note that this pattern often arises from perfectionism and deep-rooted fears: fear of complacency, fear of judgment, or fear of losing control. The mind convinces itself that pushing harder is the only way to prove worth, while resting feels like giving in to weakness or failure. This relentless cycle can fuel burnout, anxiety, and chronic dissatisfaction. You're caught in a loop where achievement is never enough, and the pause you crave feels forbidden. Victory is always postponed, locked behind ever-moving standards. Understanding the unattainable standards loop empowers you to redefine success and embrace rest as a vital part of growth. By cultivating self-compassion and setting realistic goals, you can break free from the loop, savor your achievements, and find balance between striving and being. Imagine your mouth rushing to fill every silence when anxiety grips you, words pouring out like bricks in a wall built to keep others at bay. This is the wall of words, an unconscious defense where language becomes a fortress, distancing you from vulnerability. Neuroscience shows that anxiety activates the brain's threat circuits, especially the amygdala, prompting rapid speech as a way to regain control and avoid uncomfortable silence. Psychologically, silence feels unsafe because it exposes raw emotions, uncertainty, or potential judgment. So instead, the flood of words creates a barrier, protecting the anxious self by masking fears beneath chatter. For example, in social situations, someone might dominate conversations to avoid revealing inner turmoil, unintentionally pushing others away. This phenomenon highlights how communication isn't just connection, but also defense. The wall of words paradoxically isolates, even as it seeks closeness. Understanding this pattern invites awareness that silence can be safe, and that true connection grows when words give way to presence, allowing vulnerability without barriers. Imagine standing frozen at a crossroads where even the smallest choice feels like a life-altering decision. This is the decision paralysis burn, a cognitive phenomenon where your mind fractures into countless possible futures, each shadowed by the fear that one wrong step will scar you forever. Neuroscience reveals that this paralysis stems from hyperactivity in the prefrontal cortex, responsible for planning and weighing options, combined with an overactive amygdala signaling intense fear of making mistakes. This mental overload creates a feedback loop. The more you try to decide, the more overwhelmed you become, fragmenting focus and draining energy. Psychologists observe this in anxiety disorders and perfectionism, where indecision becomes a barrier to action and progress. The brain's need for certainty clashes with the unpredictable nature of life, intensifying stress and self-doubt. Breaking free requires strategies like simplifying choices, practicing self-compassion, and embracing uncertainty as an inherent part of growth. Understanding the decision. Paralysis burn reveals why your mind stalls, not weakness, but a survival response to complexity. Awareness and gentle action can ignite movement again, turning paralysis into empowered choice. Imagine feeling an overwhelming need for a goodbye, a final word or gesture, even when parting causes pain. This urgent craving stems from the closure addiction reflex, a deep psychological impulse where incomplete endings torment your mind like doors left half closed in a locked house, haunting and unresolved. Our brains are wired to seek closure. The prefrontal cortex works tirelessly to create narratives with clear beginnings, middles, and ends, helping us make sense of experiences and move forward. When an ending is uncertain or ambiguous, the brain's discomfort spikes. This uncertainty activates the anterior cingulate cortex, which processes conflict and error detection, causing mental tension and persistent rumination. This reflex compels you to find finality, even if the truth stings, because unresolved situations trigger stress hormones like cortisol. The brain interprets ambiguity as a threat to psychological safety, prompting repetitive thoughts, obsessive searching for answers, or attempts to force closure. For example, after a sudden breakup, unanswered questions can fuel this reflex, making it hard to heal or move on. Similarly, in grief or lost opportunities, the absence of closure traps emotions in endless loops. Recognizing the closure addiction reflex helps you understand why letting go is so difficult. Through acceptance and mindfulness, you can ease the brain's need for perfect endings, allowing healing to begin even amid uncertainty. Imagine stepping into a role no child should have to fill, parenting your own parents, carrying burdens far too heavy and too early. This is the role reversal pattern, a psychological and emotional dynamic where children become caretakers before their time, blurring boundaries and reshaping family roles. Neuroscience and psychology reveal that this early responsibility rewires stress pathways in the brain, especially in the amygdala and prefrontal cortex, heightening vigilance and reducing emotional flexibility. The child's brain adapts to constant alertness, prioritizing caregiving over personal growth. This can cause adulthood to feel both intimately familiar and endlessly draining, a paradox of deep connection intertwined with chronic exhaustion. Studies on caregiving children show increased risks of anxiety, burnout, and difficulty forming healthy boundaries later in life. The role reversal pattern uncovers how early forced maturity impacts emotional development and mental health, leaving scars that persist long after childhood ends. It is a reminder that carrying others' burdens too soon shapes not just the present, but the very architecture of who you become. Imagine being met with silence. No words, no explanations, just a void that feels heavier than any accusation. This is the silence as punishment echo, where your brain interprets quiet not as calm, but as condemnation. Even without spoken blame, silence screams rejection, triggering panic and confusion deep within your nervous system. Neuroscience shows that the brain's social pain network, including the anterior cingulate cortex, processes social exclusion and rejection similarly to physical pain. When someone goes silent, this network lights up, flooding your body with stress hormones like cortisol, igniting a fight or flight response. The unknown amplifies fear, making silence feel like a threat. Psychologists find that this response is tied to early attachment experiences. When silence was used as punishment or withdrawal of love, the brain learned to equate quiet with danger. This creates hypersensitivity to absence, causing even neutral silences to trigger emotional alarms. In modern relationships where digital communication often relies on pauses and delayed replies, this bias intensifies. Your brain fills silence with imagined faults, creating internal narratives of guilt or failure. Silence becomes a roaring echo of rejection, even if none was intended. Understanding the silence as punishment echo helps you reframe quiet moments, not as judgment, but as space. By calming your nervous system and practicing perspective, you can silence the panic and restore peace amidst the stillness. Imagine waking up full of energy, only to find it slipping away by midday, not from physical exertion, but from the exhausting act of pretending everything is okay. This is the emotional battery leak, a subtle yet relentless drain caused by hiding true feelings behind a mask. Neuroscientifically, this depletion involves the prefrontal cortex working overtime to regulate emotions and maintain social facades, while the limbic system simmers with unexpressed stress or sadness. Psychologically, sustaining this performance demands constant self-monitoring and suppression. which consumes mental resources like a leaking battery losing charge. For example, someone at work may smile and nod while internally battling anxiety or sadness, gradually eroding resilience. Over time, this invisible drain leads to burnout, emotional numbness, and a profound sense of exhaustion despite rest. Understanding the emotional battery leak sheds light on why just getting through the day can feel so hard. It reveals the cost of emotional invisibility and the importance of authentic expression and self-care to recharge. Recognizing this phenomenon is the first step toward plugging the leak, honoring your true feelings to restore your energy and vitality. Imagine scrolling endlessly through a stream of perfect moments, friends smiling, successes celebrated, lives seemingly flawless. Yet, beneath that surface, you feel like a failure. This is the highlight reel comparison, a deeply ingrained cognitive trap where you measure your unfiltered struggles against others' carefully curated illusions. Neuroscience explains this through the lens of social cognition and self-perception. The brain's mirror neurons and default mode network are wired to compare, empathize, and seek social validation. But when faced with polished snapshots instead of reality's messy truth, your brain's reward circuits misfire, triggering feelings of inadequacy and diminished self-worth. Psychologists observe this phenomenon especially in social media use, where users present only highlights, editing out pain, doubt, and failure. This disparity creates a skewed social reality, reinforcing negative self-evaluation and fueling anxiety or depression. Real-life examples show people overwhelmed by envy or loneliness despite having fulfilling lives, simply because their mind fixates on others' glossy exteriors. Breaking free involves cultivating mindful awareness, recognizing the edited nature of online content, and practicing self-compassion. Understanding the highlight reel. Comparison reveals why you feel less when seeing more. It's not your story failing, but the illusion of perfection distorting your perception. Embracing your authentic journey, with all its ups and downs, is the path to genuine self-acceptance and peace. Imagine achieving success, yet feeling like a fraud, as if the applause and praise are meant for someone else, not the person you know yourself to be. This unsettling experience is called the identity imposter complex, a psychological struggle where external validation clashes with internal doubt, leaving you feeling like a stranger in your own success. At its core, this complex arises when your self-perception is fragmented or undermined by deep insecurities. Neuroscience links this to the brain's default mode network, which governs self-reflection, and the anterior insula, involved in self-awareness and emotional processing. When these systems send conflicting signals, external praise recognized but internally rejected, the mind experiences cognitive dissonance, fueling feelings of fraudulence. People with the identity imposter complex often dismiss compliments, attribute achievements to luck, or fear being exposed as a fake. This disconnect can stem from perfectionism, past criticism, or environments that never reinforced authentic self-worth. For example, a talented artist might excel publicly but internally believe their work is unworthy, or a professional might fear promotion because they feel they don't truly belong. Understanding this complex is crucial for breaking the cycle. Therapy, self-compassion, and reframing success help rebuild alignment between internal identity and external reality, so praise feels deserved and success becomes a true reflection of who you are. Imagine slowly giving away pieces of yourself, compromising a little here, a little more there, until one day you no longer recognize where your true boundaries once stood. This is self-erosion syndrome, a psychological phenomenon where continuous concessions to others chip away at your identity and self-worth. Neuroscience reveals that chronic self-sacrifice can alter neural circuits in the prefrontal cortex, which governs self-control and decision-making, weakening your ability to assert personal limits. Over time, this leads to blurred boundaries, where saying no feels impossible, and your sense of self dissolves into others' expectations. Psychologists observe this pattern in people-pleasers and those in codependent relationships, often stemming from early attachment issues or trauma. The syndrome fosters a dangerous cycle. The more you erode yourself to maintain peace or acceptance, the more lost you become, trapped in a mental fog where your desires and needs are obscured. Self-erosion syndrome is a silent thief, stealing your autonomy one small compromise at a time, until the boundaries that defined you vanish into memory. Imagine stepping outside your own life and watching yourself from above, as if you're a distant observer in a movie where you barely remember auditioning for the role. This is the dissociative observer shift, a mental state where detachment feels safer than fully inhabiting your experience. The script plays on, but you keep your distance, shielding yourself from pain or overwhelming emotion. Neuroscience reveals that this phenomenon involves altered activity in brain regions responsible for self-awareness and emotional regulation, including the prefrontal cortex and the temporoparietal junction. When stress or trauma becomes too intense, the brain may disconnect from the immediate experience, creating a protective separation that dulls feelings and awareness. Psychologists describe this shift as a coping mechanism to manage anxiety, trauma, or emotional overload. By observing rather than participating, the mind creates a buffer, reducing distress but also causing feelings of unreality and alienation. This detachment can become chronic, interfering with connection, motivation, and authentic living. While the dissociative observer shift can offer temporary relief, it signals unresolved inner conflict. Recognizing this state allows you to gently reclaim presence through grounding techniques and therapeutic support. Re-engaging with your life script with compassion and safety transforms distance into connection and silence into your own voice. Imagine creating a safe space, a comfort zone you carefully build only to tear it down again, because stillness feels more terrifying than chaos. This is the safety sabotage loop, a psychological cycle where comfort triggers hidden fears, leading you to unconsciously dismantle stability. Neuroscientifically, the brain's threat detection system, particularly the amygdala, can misinterpret calmness as vulnerability, activating anxiety in peaceful moments. Psychologically, this loop arises when past trauma or uncertainty makes chaos feel familiar, while safety feels alien and unsafe. For example, someone recovering from a turbulent relationship may push loved ones away when things get too calm, driven by a subconscious need to avoid the unknown terror of peace. This creates a cycle where stability is repeatedly sabotaged, preventing true healing. Understanding the safety sabotage loop exposes the paradox that comfort can provoke fear, revealing why breaking free requires rewiring the brain's associations. It invites you to gently face stillness, learning that peace is not a threat, but a foundation for growth and freedom beyond chaos. Imagine speaking aloud and hearing words that don't feel like your own, thoughts echoing back to you as if they took a wrong turn somewhere deep inside your mind. This is the thought echo chamber, a perplexing cognitive phenomenon where your internal voice feels alien, creating a sense of detachment from your own ideas. Neuroscience links this experience to disruptions in the brain's self-monitoring networks, particularly the anterior cingulate cortex and temporoparietal junction, which help distinguish self-generated thoughts from external input. When these systems misfire, your brain misattributes your own thoughts as unfamiliar or external, causing a split between you and your inner dialogue. Psychologists observe this in conditions like depersonalization, schizophrenia, and certain dissociative disorders, but even healthy brains can experience mild versions during extreme stress or fatigue. This alienation can trigger confusion, anxiety, and a loss of self-coherence. Studies suggest that mindfulness and grounding techniques help re-anchor the self-perception, restoring harmony between thought and identity. Understanding the thought echo chamber reveals why your mind sometimes feels like a stranger's stage and how reconnecting with your inner voice is key to reclaiming your authentic self. Imagine hearing a song that suddenly brings tears to your eyes or smelling a familiar soap that sparks a wave of panic. In that instant, your body time travels, flinging you back to a moment long past, before your conscious mind even understands what triggered the flood of emotion. This is emotional time travel, a powerful neurological response where sensory cues unlock buried memories and feelings. Our senses, especially smell and sound, have direct connections to the brain's limbic system, the seat of emotions and memory. The olfactory bulb and auditory cortex communicate closely with the amygdala and hippocampus, areas that encode emotional memories. When a sensory stimulus matches a past experience, it can instantly reactivate stored feelings, causing your body to respond as if reliving the original event. During emotional time travel, the nervous system floods with stress hormones like adrenaline, triggering fight or flight reactions. This can result in crying, panic, or overwhelming emotional waves that seem disconnected from the present moment. Common in trauma survivors, this phenomenon reveals how past wounds reside deeply in our biology, ready to surface unexpectedly. Recognizing emotional time travel helps build awareness and coping strategies, allowing the mind to anchor back to the present and soothe the body's echoes from the past. Imagine pouring your energy into helping everyone around you, always available, always giving. But beneath that generosity lies a silent, exhausting truth: guilt drives your actions. This is the fixer burnout reflex, a psychological pattern where the desire to be needed morphs into a relentless compulsion, fueled not by joy, but by fear of losing your value. Neuroscience reveals that this cycle engages the brain's reward system, releasing dopamine when helping others, but also activates stress circuits like the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, flooding the body with cortisol. Over time, this biochemical tug of war leads to emotional exhaustion and burnout. Psychologists note that many fixers tie their self-worth to their usefulness, making rest feel impossible without triggering anxiety or self-judgment. The fixer burnout reflex shows how generosity, when entangled with guilt, can become a prison rather than a gift. It's a reminder that your worth isn't conditional on constant giving, and that true self-care requires breaking the cycle, choosing yourself without fear or guilt. Imagine feeling safe only when you hold every string tightly in your hands, believing that control is your fortress against chaos. This is the control illusion reboot, where control becomes a performance, a mask hiding a deeper fear. The terror of what happens if you finally let go. Neuroscience shows that the brain's fear circuits, particularly the amygdala, activate when unpredictability looms. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for planning and decision-making, tries to regain order, but this relentless need to control often creates a feedback loop of anxiety and hypervigilance. Control feels like safety, but it's an illusion sustained by constant mental effort. Psychologists explain that this behavior often stems from early life experiences where unpredictability or trauma threatened survival. The mind adapts by mastering control, yet the paradox is that control itself becomes the prison. The real fear isn't chaos, it's vulnerability, uncertainty, and surrender. This illusion blinds you to the freedom found in trust and acceptance. By recognizing the control reboot, you can begin to loosen your grip, understanding that true safety arises not from domination, but from embracing uncertainty. Letting go is not loss, it is liberation, a reboot to a more resilient and peaceful self. Imagine whole chapters of your life slipping into shadows, forgotten, like misplaced files locked in a hidden folder. This is the memory folder misplacement, a protective mechanism where your brain tucks away traumatic or overwhelming memories to shield your consciousness. Neuroscience reveals that the hippocampus and amygdala work together to regulate memory storage. When memories carry too much emotional weight, the brain may dissociate them, making recall difficult or impossible. Psychologically, this misplacement prevents unbearable pain from flooding your present, but at a cost. For example, survivors of trauma often experience amnesia for significant periods, not because memories are lost, but because the brain hides them deep to protect you from re-traumatization. This creates gaps in personal history, leaving feelings of confusion or lost identity. Understanding memory folder. Misplacement highlights the brain's incredible adaptability. It sacrifices complete recollection to preserve mental stability. Recognizing this mechanism is crucial in trauma recovery, as gently reopening these folders with professional support can promote healing, reintegration, and reclaiming of your narrative. Imagine looking at someone else and feeling an intense dislike, not for who they truly are, but for traits that secretly live within you. This is the projection defense pattern, a psychological mechanism where judgment becomes a mirror reflecting parts of yourself you're unwilling to face. Neuroscience and psychology reveal this as a form of unconscious defense, rooted in the brain's self-awareness and emotional regulation circuits, particularly involving the medial prefrontal cortex and amygdala. When confronted with uncomfortable aspects of the self, the mind projects these traits onto others to avoid internal conflict and preserve a coherent self-image. This deflection can cause interpersonal tension, distorted perceptions, and emotional blind spots. Examples abound, from criticizing arrogance in others while harboring pride yourself, to resenting dishonesty when struggling with your own truth. Recognizing projection requires courageous self-reflection and empathy, breaking the cycle of blame and enabling authentic growth. Understanding the projection defense pattern reveals how judgment often masks hidden vulnerabilities and how embracing those shadows fosters deeper self-awareness and compassion. Imagine your days folding into repetitive loops, not out of boredom or habit, but because your brain has wired routine as a shield against fear. This is the routine survival circuit, a deeply ingrained coping system where novelty sparks anxiety and repetition feels like safety. Neurologically, this involves heightened activity in the amygdala, the brain's fear center, which flags unfamiliar experiences as threats. To counteract this, the basal ganglia and prefrontal cortex promote familiar patterns and rituals, reducing uncertainty and calming the nervous system. This survival circuit can develop from trauma, chronic stress, or unstable environments where unpredictability was dangerous. Over time, your brain prioritizes sameness to maintain a sense of control, even if it limits growth and joy. People caught in this loop may resist change, cling to rituals, or feel paralyzed when facing the new. What looks like stubbornness is actually a biological strategy to manage overwhelming fear. Understanding the routine. Survival circuit reveals why breaking free is challenging. Healing requires gentle exposure to novelty, building trust in your resilience, and rewiring the brain to see change not as danger, but as possibility. Imagine feeling perfectly fine, going about your day when suddenly, without warning, a tiny event shatters your emotional balance, plunging you into an overwhelming collapse that seems far too big for the cause. This is the emotional sinkhole snap, a psychological phenomenon where suppressed stress and unresolved emotions accumulate beneath the surface, creating a fragile emotional state. Neuroscience reveals that chronic stress sensitizes the amygdala and disrupts the prefrontal cortex's ability to regulate emotions, making the brain prone to sudden, disproportionate reactions. What appears as an overreaction is actually the mind's release valve after long-term emotional buildup. For example, a minor criticism or accidental slight can ignite intense feelings because it taps into deeper, unaddressed wounds. Studies of trauma survivors and individuals with mood disorders show that these snap moments are common and reflect a brain struggling to maintain equilibrium. The emotional sinkhole. Snap reminds us that beneath calm surfaces can lie a reservoir of tension, and understanding this can foster compassion for yourself and others when emotions erupt unexpectedly. Imagine walking into a calm room, but your mind remains on high alert, scanning every corner, every shadow, as if danger lurks behind every smile. This is the hypervigilance burnout state, where your nervous system never truly rests. Instead of silencing the alarm, it learns to hide the warning bells beneath a fragile surface. Neuroscience reveals that chronic stress and trauma hyperactivate the amygdala, the brain's threat detector. Over time, constant alarm flooding exhausts the prefrontal cortex's ability to regulate fear responses. Your brain adapts by suppressing visible signs of anxiety, masking the internal chaos while remaining tense and reactive. Psychologists explain that this hidden hypervigilance leads to emotional exhaustion and burnout. You may feel numb or detached externally, but inside, your system is wired to respond to perceived threats instantly. This silent tension can impair sleep, focus, and relationships, eroding quality of life. Understanding the hypervigilance burnout state helps you recognize that your body is still fighting invisible battles. Recovery requires patience, safety, and practices that retrain your brain's stress response, like mindfulness, therapy, and rest. Only then can the alarm bells quiet, allowing peace to return beneath the surface. Imagine suddenly lashing out or shutting down, overwhelmed by emotions you can't trace back to the present moment. This is the trauma trigger misdirection, when your reactions aren't to what's happening now, but to shadows from your past. Neuroscience shows that traumatic memories are stored differently in the brain, often fragmented and linked to heightened amygdala activity, which governs fear responses. When a current situation unconsciously resembles a past trauma, even in subtle ways, it hijacks your nervous system. Psychologically, this misdirection means you respond not to the current event, but to ghosts from old wounds, causing confusion and self-judgment. For example, someone might freeze or explode in anger during a harmless disagreement triggered by unresolved childhood fear. The brain's inability to fully process trauma leaves it lurking beneath everyday interactions, distorting reactions and relationships. Understanding the trauma trigger. Misdirection reveals that these reactions are survival echoes, not personal failings. Awareness allows you to recognize and untangle past from present, opening a path to healing and regaining control over your responses. Imagine leaving a therapy session feeling worse than before, as if talking has unlocked something, but your body hasn't yet caught up to the changes your brain started. This is the therapy echo effect, a real and scientifically grounded phenomenon where emotional breakthroughs create ripples through mind and body that take time to settle. Neuroscience shows that while the brain's prefrontal cortex begins reframing traumatic memories or entrenched beliefs during therapy, the autonomic nervous system and limbic system may remain activated, causing lingering stress responses. This mismatch can produce temporary discomfort, anxiety, or emotional overwhelm as your body adjusts to new neural pathways and shifts in perception. Psychologists note that this effect is common in trauma therapy and deep emotional work, where uncovering buried feelings triggers physiological reactions before relief sets in. Understanding the therapy echo effect reveals why healing isn't always immediate. It's a process of gradual integration between mind and body. With patience, grounding techniques, and continued support, this echo fades, leaving space for lasting transformation and emotional balance. Imagine setting a simple boundary, saying no or stepping back, and instantly feeling like the villain in your own story. This intense guilt isn't just in your head, it's the boundaries as threat reflex, a deeply ingrained response where protecting yourself activates pain rooted in years of enforced submission. From early life, many learn that asserting limits invites punishment, rejection, or conflict. The brain's threat detection system, centered in the amygdala, becomes hypersensitive to boundary setting, interpreting it as social danger. Meanwhile, the anterior cingulate cortex processes the resulting guilt and social pain, making self-protection feel like betrayal. This reflex keeps people trapped in cycles of people-pleasing and self-neglect. Even when boundaries are healthy and necessary, the internalized programming turns them into perceived threats to relationships and self-worth. For example, saying no to extra work may cause overwhelming guilt. Insisting on personal space might feel selfish. These reactions stem from survival strategies developed to maintain fragile social acceptance. Understanding the boundaries as threat reflex is key to healing. Through awareness, therapy, and gradual practice, you can rewire your brain to see boundaries as acts of self-respect, not rebellion, freeing yourself from guilt and reclaiming your power. Imagine waking up with a restless mind that scorns rest itself. Sleeping in feels sinful, and taking a break feels like failure. This is the rest. As rebellion syndrome, a deep-seated psychological and cultural pattern where exhaustion is mistaken for achievement. Neuroscience reveals that chronic stress floods the brain with cortisol, hijacking the hypothalamus and impairing restorative sleep, while cultural conditioning trains the prefrontal cortex to equate relentless work with worthiness. This syndrome often stems from early environments where productivity was praised and rest was punished, embedding a survival mindset that values exhaustion as proof of effort and importance. Psychologists find that individuals trapped in this cycle struggle with guilt whenever they slow down, perpetuating burnout and chronic fatigue. The rest as rebellion syndrome exposes a harsh paradox. To survive, the body needs rest, but the mind rebels against it, fearing loss of identity or value. Recognizing this pattern is the first step toward reclaiming self-care and redefining worth beyond endless toil. Imagine feeling a kind hand on your shoulder and suddenly tears well up because beneath the surface, your body remembers absence louder than comfort. This is the touch starvation memory, where the lack of nurturing physical contact leaves an imprint deeper than words, shaping your emotional and physiological responses. Neuroscience shows that human touch releases oxytocin, the bonding hormone, which calms the nervous system and builds trust. But when touch is scarce, especially during critical developmental periods, the brain's wiring adapts to expect withdrawal and loneliness instead. This creates a heightened sensitivity to touch later in life, where even gentle contact can unlock buried pain. Psychologists observe that touch starvation links to increased stress, anxiety, and difficulty forming close relationships. The body's memory of deprivation causes an emotional echo. Moments of comfort trigger a flood of feelings connected to long-term neglect or isolation. This can manifest as overwhelming vulnerability, where soothing becomes startling. Understanding the touch starvation memory reveals how vital physical connection is to emotional health. Healing requires gentle, consistent nurturing to retrain the brain and body to trust comfort again, transforming absence into presence and fear into safety. Imagine losing someone dear, yet feeling nothing at first, as if your emotions are on pause, waiting in silence. This is the grief delay mechanism, a psychological defense where your brain postpones pain to protect you during overwhelming moments. Neuroscience shows that the brain's stress and emotion centers, like the amygdala and prefrontal cortex, modulate grief responses. Initially, they may suppress feelings to help you cope with immediate demands. Psychologically, this delay allows you to function amid crisis, but the postponed pain eventually floods in during solitude or rest. For example, many experience a numbness or disbelief right after loss, only to confront deep sorrow weeks later when distractions fade. This mechanism can feel disorienting, as grief seems to arrive out of sync with reality. Understanding the grief delay mechanism reveals grief's complex timing and the brain's attempt to balance survival with healing. Recognizing this process helps normalize delayed emotions and encourages compassionate self-care when the flood finally comes, opening the way toward eventual acceptance and peace. Imagine sitting in a quiet room when suddenly your mind spirals into questions about your entire life, the meaning, the purpose, the very reason you exist. This is the purpose panic spiral, a profound psychological and neurological experience where the silence invites overwhelming feelings of meaninglessness and existential dread. Neuroscience shows that during these moments, the brain's default mode network, responsible for self-reflection and future planning, becomes hyperactive, while the limbic system amplifies feelings of anxiety and fear. This intense self-scrutiny can trigger a cascade of panic as the mind grapples with uncertain or unsettling answers. Psychologists observe this spiral in existential crises, depression, and anxiety disorders where the search for meaning turns into a distressing feedback loop. The silence that once offered peace now echoes with doubts that feel unbearable. Breaking free involves grounding techniques, mindfulness, and reframing thoughts to accept uncertainty as part of life's journey. Understanding the purpose. Panic spiral reveals why quiet moments can feel terrifying, not because your life lacks meaning, but because your mind resists facing the vast unknown. With patience and support, you can learn to sit with the silence and find calm within the spiral. Imagine waking up each day to find yourself subtly changed. Thoughts, feelings, even beliefs shifting so quickly that yesterday's self feels like a stranger. This dizzying experience is called self-concept overload, a psychological state where rapid internal change overwhelms your sense of identity, leaving behind a haunting grief for the you that's fading away. Our brains constantly update self-representations based on new information, social feedback, and experiences. Normally, this process is gradual, allowing continuity. But during periods of intense stress, transition, or trauma, neural networks in the prefrontal cortex and default mode network become hyperactive, accelerating shifts in self-perception. As your self-concept fractures and evolves at breakneck speed, it becomes difficult to anchor to any stable identity. This instability can cause confusion, loneliness, and a subtle mourning for past versions of yourself, as if pieces of your soul are constantly lost and replaced. People undergoing major life changes, mental health challenges, or identity crises often face self-concept overload. Recognizing this allows space for compassion and grounding practices that slow the flood of change, helping rebuild a coherent, resilient self that embraces transformation without grief. Imagine waking up each day to find yourself subtly changed. Thoughts, feelings, even beliefs shifting so quickly that yesterday's self feels like a stranger. This dizzying experience is called self-concept overload, a psychological state where rapid internal change overwhelms your sense of identity, leaving behind a haunting grief for the you that's fading away. Our brains constantly update self-representations based on new information, social feedback, and experiences. Normally, this process is gradual, allowing continuity. But during periods of intense stress, transition, or trauma, neural networks in the prefrontal cortex and default mode network become hyperactive, accelerating shifts in self-perception. As your self-concept fractures and evolves at breakneck speed, it becomes difficult to anchor to any stable identity. This instability can cause confusion, loneliness, and a subtle mourning for past versions of yourself, as if pieces of your soul are constantly lost and replaced. People undergoing major life changes, mental health challenges, or identity crises often face self-concept overload. Recognizing this allows space for compassion and grounding practices that slow the flood of change, helping rebuild a coherent, resilient self that embraces transformation without grief. Imagine snapping at someone over a small irritation, a seemingly minor trigger that unleashes a storm you didn't expect. But that moment isn't really about the small thing at all. It's a translation of your inner turmoil, a signal flare for 10 other emotions your body never got permission to express. Neuroscience shows that the brain and body are inseparable in processing emotion. When feelings like sadness, frustration, or fear are suppressed, they don't disappear. Instead, they build pressure in the nervous system, often erupting through unrelated situations. The limbic system, especially the amygdala, reacts strongly, while the prefrontal cortex struggles to contain the overflow. Psychologists call this phenomenon emotional displacement, when your brain redirects unexpressed emotions onto safer or more immediate targets. It's not intentional misbehavior, it's a survival strategy to manage overwhelming feelings that were never fully voiced or validated. This inner turmoil can accumulate from years of emotional neglect, trauma, or societal conditioning that tells you to hide vulnerability. Each snap is a coded message from your subconscious, urging acknowledgement of the deeper unrest. Understanding the inner turmoil translation allows you to pause before reacting, to listen beneath the surface. By granting yourself permission to feel and express all emotions honestly, you begin to unravel the pressure, transforming small outbursts into pathways for healing and self-awareness. Imagine sitting in quiet and suddenly feeling a chill, like something is wrong, even when nothing has changed. This is the paranoia drift effect, a cognitive shadow cast by past betrayals that trains your mind to expect danger in silence. Neuroscience shows that trauma rewires the brain's threat detection systems, especially the amygdala and prefrontal cortex, making you hypervigilant, scanning for hidden threats even where none exist. Psychologically, this leads you to read too deeply into neutral or silent moments, interpreting them as signs of impending harm. For example, after betrayal, a simple pause in conversation might feel like a knife waiting to strike. This constant anticipation of danger fuels anxiety and distrust, isolating you from genuine connection. Understanding the paranoia drift effect reveals how past wounds distort present reality, creating false alarms that wear down your sense of safety. Recognizing this drift is the first step toward recalibrating your inner radar, learning to distinguish true threats from echoes of old pain, and reclaiming peace in silence. Imagine waking up one morning and feeling hollow, not sad, not broken, just gone. Like the you built has vanished without a goodbye. This is the vanishing self phenomenon, a deeply disorienting psychological state where your sense of identity feels suspended or erased. Neuroscience links this experience to disruptions in the brain's default mode network, responsible for self-referential processing, alongside altered activity in the insula and anterior cingulate cortex, areas tied to emotional awareness and body sense. Trauma, dissociation, or intense stress can trigger this shutdown, causing a detachment from your own thoughts, feelings, and memories. Psychologists recognize it as a form of depersonalization or dissociative episode, where the continuity of self temporarily fractures. This state can leave you feeling like a ghost in your own life, present but disconnected. Recovery involves gentle grounding, reconnecting with sensory experiences, and therapeutic approaches aimed at reintegrating fragmented identity. Understanding the vanishing self phenomenon sheds light on why sometimes the I feels lost, and offers hope that the self, though hidden, can be found again.